One night in March of 2016, two friends sat on a couch in Lunel, France, watching a true crime show on TV. And the episode really hit close to home, literally, because it was about a missing person who had vanished just miles away from where they lived. And so they're watching the show, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of it, one of the friends suddenly stood up and began pacing around the room, muttering to themselves. And when the other friend, who was still sitting on the couch watching this, asked them what was wrong, they were not ready for the answer. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a really nice, really expensive steak dinner. But make sure you first significantly dull their steak knife. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At 4:30 p.m. on June 23, 2014, 49-year-old Patrick Issoire hurried out the side door of a hospital in Sète, France, buttoning a fresh collared shirt as he ran to the parking lot. He climbed onto his scooter and then quickly checked his watch, and then he lifted the kickstand and sped off into traffic, ignoring honks from all the other drivers as he swerved between the cars. Patrick did not care who he was annoying right now, because he was running late for a date, and then right after the date, he had to rush over to his daughter's dance recital. And he desperately wanted to make sure he made both of these events, because they were some of the only things he'd had to look forward to in ages. So things in Patrick's life had not been good for a really long time. 8 years earlier, he had slipped into a rut of serious binge drinking and gambling. And one day, when he was drunk, he had actually struck his wife. Following that, his wife had divorced him, and he'd lost custody of his daughter, Alabama, who was now 12 years old. After that, Patrick's life really did not get any better. He had moved in with his elderly mother, and his drinking had only gotten worse, and his gambling continued to the point where he basically gambled away most of what he made by working as a hospital janitor. And then after that, he'd gotten involved with a married coworker, and then when her husband found out about this affair, she died of an apparent suicide. Her death had been 5 years earlier, and it had been so traumatic that Patrick had barely dated since. He had just about resigned himself to a life of bachelorhood, when actually a few weeks earlier, he had gotten a call from the woman he was now going to meet, Audrey Levay. But Patrick was now running so late for his date that he worried Audrey might not wait around for him. So he twisted the throttle of his scooter and shot across an intersection, ignoring more honks from more cars. Patrick had actually met Audrey a long time ago, right after his divorce, and they'd gone out a handful of times before they ultimately lost touch. She was a lot younger than he was, and she'd stood him up more than once in the past. But she was also a lot of fun, and it had been a while since Patrick had been on a date, so when she called him up saying she wanted to go out again, Patrick had said, sure. They'd made plans to meet this afternoon at a park near Patrick's work that had this big rocky hill rising behind it. And the place had some of the best views in the whole city, with the ocean on one side and dramatic cliffs dotted with all these old caves on the other. Now, they were not going to have a whole lot of time together, probably just enough for a short walk before Patrick would have to rush off for his daughter's dance recital later that night. But he hoped that the romantic setting might help spark something between them again. A few minutes later, Patrick pulled up to the park entrance, and to his relief, Audrey was still there waiting for him. So he parked his scooter and locked his cell phone in the scooter's underseat compartment, and he walked over to her. And from her nervous smile, he got the sense that she was almost as excited about the date as he was, which gave him a nice boost of confidence. So he took her hand, and they started down the path. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, 10 miles up the coastline from where Patrick and Audrey had been walking at that park, Patrick's older brother, Mark Issoire, stood on the deck of his boat, pulling a big oyster trap out of the water. As he was doing this, his phone rang, so he stopped and he answered it. But before he could even say hello, his mother's very worried voice came across the line, asking if he knew where Patrick was. Mark frowned because Patrick lived with their mother, so she should know better than he would. But his mother explained that Patrick hadn't come home last night. He also wasn't answering his phone, he hadn't shown up to work that morning, and perhaps most concerning of all, he'd missed his daughter's dance recital the previous evening. And it was this last fact that made Mark think that something might actually be wrong here, because he knew how much Patrick loved his daughter and how much he was looking forward to that recital. So he promised his mother he would get to the bottom of it. Then he hung up and began calling Patrique's friends. However, with each conversation he had, Mark got more worried because nobody had heard from Patrique since yesterday afternoon. He'd apparently left work around 4 p.m., but he hadn't told anybody where he was going. Now for Mark, he felt like this was at least somewhere to start, Patrique's work. So he steered his boat to the dock, tied it off, and then jumped in his car and started heading that direction. 4 hours later, Mark stood on a rocky lookout point scanning the city below. Patrique's hospital stood in the middle of Set's business district, which was packed with canals and cafes and tourist spots, and Mark and a handful of Patrique's friends had spent all morning checking them one by one, looking for Patrique, but they hadn't found him or any sign of him. And so now Mark had turned his focus to some of the more remote areas around the city, like the hill behind the park where he now stood. But there was still no sign of Patrique anywhere. And so Mark was trying to think of anywhere else his brother might have gone when his phone rang. It was one of Patrique's friends from the search party, and he just found Patrique's scooter outside the park at the bottom of the hill, just a short drive from where Mark was. And so Mark told him not to touch anything, and he sprinted back to his car, and he sped down the hill, and he left the park, and he stopped in the parking lot right outside. And sure enough, there in the lot was Patrique's scooter. And as Mark looked at the scooter and at the quiet park all around him, he felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, because he really couldn't think of any reason why Patrique would leave his scooter here overnight. In the back of his mind all day, Mark had been worried that something bad could have happened to his little brother. But now, after seeing this scooter, he felt sure of it. Almost 2 weeks later, at 8 a.m. on July 5th, 2014, Detective Boris Verrier took the exit ramp toward the French town of Set. And as the sunlight hit his windshield, he had to squint as he looked out at the long stretch of beaches and canals framed by these beautiful rocky cliffs in a small, dense urban center. Verrier was a senior investigator from the nearby city of Montpellier, but he had just been called in to take over a missing persons case that had stumped the local police in Set. About 2 weeks earlier, 49-year-old Patrique Isouard had disappeared after going on a date with a woman whose name was Audrey Louvet. The local police had already spoken to Audrey, who said she didn't know what had happened to Patrique. She said they had gone for a walk, and then he had escorted her to her bus, and then after that, she'd assumed that Patrique just sort of went back to his scooter and carried on with his night. But the scooter had been found the next day, still parked, where he and Audrey had met up for their date, with no sign of Patrique anywhere nearby. And now, almost 2 weeks later, Patrique had still not turned up. Since then, Patrique's brother, Mark, had been helping the investigation. Verrier had spoken to Mark on the phone, and Mark had talked about Patrique like he was a saint, a guy who would drop everything to help out somebody in a jam, who never got into fights and had really no enemies. But Verrier didn't necessarily believe this, because in his experience, people who inexplicably vanished oftentimes were kidnapped or murdered. Now, he had no reason to actually suspect that around Patrique. He could have just as easily gotten into an accident, fallen off a cliff, or maybe he chose to vanish. But at this point, what Verrier really needed to do was, on his own, dig into who Patrique was and figure out if there was a reason why he wasn't here right now. Do you want a treat that's both refreshing and indulgent? Well, My Mochi ice cream is creamy, premium ice cream wrapped in sweet, chewy dough that is absolutely satisfying and joyfully chill. My Mochi comes in delicious flavors like strawberry, mango, and cookies and cream. The strawberry is made with real fruit and tastes like biting into the perfect strawberry at peak summer. It's the perfect balance of chewy and creamy and fruity and cozy. But my favorite flavor is for sure cookies and cream. It's dreamy, creamy, and the cookie bits keep it fun. I take them out of the freezer and I let them soften up just a little bit, and then I can't stop eating them. My Mochi is also gluten-free and only around 70 calories per piece. It comes in a box with 6 individual snacks, which makes it really easy to share. That is, if you want to. Look for the purple box of My Mochi ice cream in the freezer aisle of your local grocery store. A few minutes later, Verrier followed Patrique's ex-wife, whose name was Claude Ozize, into her living room, and they both sat down. Verrier switched on his recording device, and he asked Claude where she was on the day Patrique went missing. Claude said it was just an ordinary Monday for her, and that after work she had picked up their daughter, Alabama, from school and driven her to her dance recital. She had expected to meet Patrick there at the recital, and it really surprised her when he didn't show up, because even though Patrick had plenty of flaws, he was a good dad. And at that, Verrier sort of leaned forward, because Patrick's flaws were actually what he wanted to know about. Now, he didn't think Claude was guilty of anything here, since she had a pretty strong alibi and didn't really stand to benefit from Patrick's disappearance. But he hoped she could maybe tell him about any old habits or current habits that could have gotten Patrick into trouble. And so when he asked her about this, Claude hesitated before saying she really didn't want to badmouth Patrick. But he drank and gambled a lot more than he should. At this point, Verrier pressed her for more details, but Claude just insisted that Patrick had really always kept that part of his life away from her. But after she thought about it for a moment, she said there was someone who might be able to tell Verrier more. And then she called their 12-year-old daughter, Alabama, into the room. Alabama appeared very visibly nervous and shaken up by everything going on with her dad, but her mother, Claude, took her hand and encouraged her to share her story. And slowly, the girl began to speak. She said that about a week before her dad disappeared, he'd brought her along on a very strange errand. They'd parked outside of a tunnel, and he'd told her to wait in the car. And then he got out and walked into this tunnel to meet with someone. It was a man. But it was too dark in the tunnel for Alabama to make out the man's features, but she definitely saw her father, Patrick, hand this man some kind of package before he quickly turned and ran back to the car. And then afterwards, her father wouldn't tell her who this man was. He just said that he'd done something really stupid, and because of it, he now owed some people a lot of money. After Alabama finished talking, her mother, Claude, thanked her and sent her back out of the room. And then once she was gone, Verrier asked Claude if she knew who this man in the tunnel might be. But Claude said she had no idea. But she said she did have one name that was worth looking into. Now, this was not someone who would have lent Patrick any money, but instead, it was a man who held a personal grudge against him. His name was Remy Chen, and he was a local hairstylist. An hour later, Verrier sat in a cramped cubicle of the Sète police station, scrolling through a file on his laptop. Based on Claude's tip, he'd looked up the hairstylist's name in the police database and had immediately found a connection to Patrick. Back in 2009, so a few years after Patrick's divorce, Patrick had been questioned as a witness in the suicide of Remy Chen's wife, a woman named Nadège Chen, who had worked with Patrick at the hospital. Apparently, Nadège had come home after a work party and confessed to Remy that she'd been having this affair with Patrick. The couple argued for hours about it, and Nadège ended up sleeping on the couch while Remy went upstairs to their bedroom. And then the next day, Remy found Nadège in their garage, hanging by the neck. As soon as Verrier was done reading this, he knew he finally had a suspect, and so he looked up Remy's last known address and contact information. At around 10 a.m. the next day, so July 7th, Verrier followed Remy Chen into an interrogation room at the Sète police station and shut the door behind them. Remy was a short, wiry man with a very obvious scowl on his face that made it clear he thought he was being very inconvenienced here. Verrier immediately got the feeling that Remy would likely only crack under intense pressure. So right away, he tried to shake Remy by saying they knew he was involved in the kidnapping of Patrick Isouard. Now, this was a total bluff because Verrier did not actually have any evidence, but he wanted to see how Remy would react. And to his surprise and irritation, Remy just laughed. Remy acted like he literally had no idea who Verrier was even talking about. And when Verrier brought up his late wife and sort of insinuated that obviously Patrick had had an affair and was a witness when she had died, Remy just scoffed and reminded him that it had been 5 years since her passing. He said he had moved on and begun dating other people. And anyways, it was sort of absurd to think that he would hold a grudge for 5 years without doing anything, but then suddenly now decide to take some sort of revenge out of the blue. It just didn't add up. But Verrier didn't really know what to make of this. It seemed like Remy was really confident, almost too confident. And so he pivoted and just asked Remy where he was on June 23rd, the day Patrick went missing. And after thinking for a moment, Remy just said that he had spent the whole afternoon alone cleaning out a storage unit that he had rented. This was obviously not a great alibi at all, but at this point Verrier had no choice but to let Remy go. As Verrier watched Remy leave, he knew he was running out of time here. 2 weeks had already passed since Patrick's disappearance, and every day the odds of finding him alive got worse. So out of desperation, Verrier decided to circle back to the very start and speak again to Audrey Louvet. I mean, being the last person to see Patrick before he went missing, Audrey was an obvious person of interest. But Verrier wasn't sure what more he could learn from her. The local police had already questioned her at the very beginning of the investigation, and Verrier had already watched that interview tape a number of times. But Verrier knew he just had to take a shot. So he picked up the phone and he called Audrey into the station. Later that same afternoon, around 2 p.m., Verrier sat across from Audrey in the same room where he just interviewed Remy. He said hello to her and he started the recorder, and then he asked her to explain her history with Patrick again. And at first, her answers were all just like they'd been on the tape. She said they had met 8 years ago in 2006, and they'd dated casually for a while before losing contact. And then, just a few weeks ago, she happened to pass the bar where they first met, and it made her think of Patrick. So she'd called him up out of the blue to ask how he was doing, and they'd ultimately made plans to see each other again. She described their date as being a short walk around the park, after which Patrick had walked her to the bus stop and then headed off, presumably to go back to his scooter and to head off to his daughter's dance recital. And that's when Verrier interrupted, and he asked Audrey to tell him specifically which direction Patrick had headed off after dropping her off at the bus stop. And Audrey sat there for a minute, and then she said, I can't remember. And this really bothered Verrier, because here was this person who should be able to tell him the most about Patrick's last moves, and she had basically nothing useful to offer the investigation. So Verrier just sort of dropped the polite tone and really went after her. He told her he wasn't buying her act and that she needed to tell him everything she knew right now, or this was all going to get much, much worse for her. Audrey's eyes went wide and her voice began to shake as she insisted that she'd already told them everything. But Verrier didn't let up. He kept demanding that she just admit what she'd done until he was practically shouting at her. And Audrey was in tears, and she was repeating over and over that Patrick had been fine when she left him. She just didn't remember all the details. And finally, Verrier backed off. He'd run countless interrogations throughout his career, and his gut was starting to tell him that Audrey's fragility was not really an act here. He'd pushed her as hard as he could, and he had to admit that maybe she was just telling the truth. A little while later, after Audrey was gone, Verrier sat alone inside the interrogation room, thinking about the case. He hadn't managed to rule out any suspects yet, and he still had no idea who that mysterious man in the tunnel might be. And on top of all that, there was still the possibility that no crime had been committed here, since they had no body. I mean, who knows what really happened to Patrick at this point? And Verrier knew that there were just too many unknowns. And Verrier knew that if the case was ever going to gain real traction, they needed to find Patrick, dead or alive. Around 11 a.m. on July 17th, so 3.5 weeks after Patrick Isouard disappeared, Detective Boris Verrier parked along the shoulder of a winding roadside in the French town of Sète. He got out of his car, he stooped beneath a strip of yellow police tape, and he headed across the long strip of dry grass leading up to a sheer cliff wall. A dozen yards ahead of him, barely visible in the rock face, was the dark, round opening of a cave. A few hours earlier, a group of teenagers had shown up at the police station seeming very frazzled, saying they had found a human body inside of that cave. And as soon as Verrier had heard about this, he had rushed to the scene because the cave was less than a half a mile away from where Patrick's scooter had been abandoned. And so now, Verrier turned on his flashlight and he stepped into the cave. And as soon as he did, a forensics team fell into step right behind him, and together, they began making their way into the darkness. Thanks to his flashlight, Verrier could see that the walls were covered in graffiti and that there were empty bottles and other garbage everywhere, so it seemed like this was probably a popular party spot for young people. As they moved deeper, the cave split off into a maze of all these different narrow tunnels, and just as Verrier was about to direct his team to spread out and begin searching all of them, he passed by one of these tunnels that absolutely reeked. And so Verrier stopped what he was doing and just aimed his flashlight down this particular tunnel. And he saw there was a shallow pit dug into the floor. And lying at the bottom of this pit was what looked like a ragged lump of black fabric, until Verrier stepped closer. The smell was overpowering now, and Verrier knew he was standing over the charred remains of a human body. Verrier bent down to examine it, and he saw right away there was what appeared to be a bullet hole in the skull and a bullet hole to the torso. And those details, one to the head, one to the stomach, and then, the body being burnt afterwards, likely to get rid of evidence, felt very familiar to Verrier. It felt like this could have been a mob hit. A year and a half later, so just before Christmas of 2015, Detective Verrier was in his office in Montpellier when his phone rang. It was Patrick's older brother, Marc, calling to ask for updates on his brother's case, again. And Verrier sighed because the truth was, he had nothing new to report. The body in the cave had been confirmed to be Patrick, and so Verrier had hoped that that discovery would lead to all these new leads. But after scouring the cave for clues and testing the cigarettes from the scene for DNA and speaking to the teenagers who reported the body, the case just hit a dead end. Now, the mob-like execution style did line up with a theory that Verrier had that, maybe Patrick had been killed over a gambling debt, by the mob basically, or someone who was affiliated with, organized crime. But Verrier had never been able to actually uncover any trace of Patrick having any sort of debt that would get him killed. Also, he still had not been able to identify that mysterious man in the tunnel that Patrick's daughter had mentioned. And so that left Remy and also Audrey as his only suspects. And Verrier had placed both of them under surveillance, but so far, neither of them had done anything suspicious. So the investigation was now stuck, and Verrier understood that Patrick's family was really out of patience here. So he was not surprised that when he admitted he still was not ready to make an arrest, Marc snapped. He told Verrier that if the police weren't capable of solving this, he was going to take matters into his own hands. 3 months later, on a night in March of 2016, Detective Verrier sat down on his couch in his living room to watch something that he'd been warned was coming. Marc had convinced the producers of a national true crime TV show to do an episode on his brother's case, and the episode was airing tonight. And as the show started, Verrier felt a knot of anxiety, because Marc knew details about the investigation that were not meant for the public, and if he shared them on this show, it could seriously compromise the case. But obviously, Verrier was also just curious to see how the episode had turned out, and part of him hoped that maybe renewed public attention might actually help the case. And as Verrier watched the show, he was relieved to see that Marc wasn't there to talk about case specifics. He was there to talk about Patrick. Marc described his brother as this hardworking father who never seemed to catch a break in life, and who at the very least deserved justice. And at the end, he put out a simple plea for anyone with information to please come forward. When the show ended, Verrier did not really feel worried anymore that anything that had been revealed on the show was sensitive or that it could negatively impact the actual investigation. But he also knew that, the impact the show was going to have was probably going to be pretty small. Like, he didn't expect anything to come of this plea for help from the public. However, he would be wrong, because the next morning, Verrier's phone would ring. And an hour after that call came in, Verrier was ringing the doorbell of an apartment building in Lunel, which is a town close to Sète. A woman would answer the door, and when Verrier flashed his badge, she invited him inside. The woman, whose name was Sophie, had reached out to the police after watching Marc's interview on TV, saying she did have information about Patrick's case. And so Verrier followed her into her kitchen, and he sat down across the table from her, and he turned on his recorder, and he told her to just start from the beginning. And the moment the story began to spill out, Verrier knew he'd solved the case. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and witness testimony, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Patrick Isouard on the afternoon of Monday, June 23, 2014. At 4:30 p.m., the killer stood on a rocky hill overlooking a park in Sète, watching through a pair of binoculars while Patrick and Audrey walked hand in hand down a paved path below. The couple was taking their time, clearly enjoying the scenery and each other's company, and then at some point, Audrey stopped and pointed across the road at a cave in the nearby cliffs, the entrance to a cave. And when the killer saw this, their heart began to race, and they watched intently as the couple actually crossed the road and went into the cave and vanished. At this point, the killer lowered their binoculars and put them inside of the large duffel bag they had brought with them. Then, after slinging this bag, they hustled down the hill and went right to the entrance of the cave. When they reached the entrance to the cave, they stopped, and they put that bag on the ground. They unzipped it, and out of it they pulled a large rifle, a roll of duct tape, and also a white mask. The killer put the mask on, and with the rifle and tape in hand, they entered the cave. And they could hear the sound of Patrick and Audrey inside. They had not gone far, and they clearly had not clocked the killer coming in. They were sort of wrapped up in their date. However, when the killer got close enough, the couple heard their footsteps, and they turned around. When Audrey saw the killer in their mask with the gun, she began to scream, and Patrick, he just went white as a ghost. Before the couple could even react, the killer threw the duct tape at Audrey and told her that if she wanted to live, she would do exactly as instructed. Then the killer told Audrey to use this tape and bind Patrick's wrists and ankles. And at first, Audrey just stood there in stunned silence, but eventually she composed herself and she obeyed. And as she was binding Patrick just also stood there in stunned silence, not really sure what to even do. When Audrey was done, the killer told her to leave the cave and to not say anything about what had happened here. She hesitated just long enough to glance back at Patrick, but then she turned and she ran. Once her footsteps had faded and it was just the killer and Patrick inside of this cave, Patrick just stared, wondering what was going to happen to him, and the killer, after making really intense eye contact with Patrick, raised his rifle and shot Patrick in the head and also once in the chest, and Patrick crumpled to the ground. At that point, the killer slung his rifle, and then he grabbed Patrick by the ankles and he dragged his body down a nearby tunnel and dumped him in that shallow pit. Then the killer doused the body with lighter fluid from a canister they'd brought in that bag. They lit a match and tossed it in. As Patrick's body began to burn, the killer walked out of the cave and pulled off their mask as soon as they stepped into the light. They now had only one thing left to do: go find Audrey and explain everything, and convince her not to go to the police. Because the killer was Remy Shen, the hairstylist who hated Patrick for having an affair with his late wife, and he had just successfully tricked Audrey into helping him pull this murder off. It would turn out Audrey was actually Remy's ex-girlfriend. They had met and begun dating in 2009, shortly after the death of Remy's wife. And Remy had realized that because of Audrey's history with Patrick, because they had also dated, he could use her to lure Patrick into a trap and finally take his revenge. But even though Audrey was clearly a key part of this plan, she didn't actually know that Remy was going to kill Patrick. Remy had told her a sob story about Patrick owing him a lot of money, and she thought they were just going to scare him into paying up. It was not until she got into the cave and Remy showed up with a mask on and a rifle that she realized he had something way more sinister in his mind. After the murder, Remy convinced Audrey to stay silent by threatening to kill her and her children. And for over a year, she kept his secret, lying to the police the whole time. But when she watched that true crime episode about the case and saw Mark's plea for information, she finally just cracked and confessed to her friend Sophie, who was watching the show with her, who then went on to call the police the very next day. On March 31st, 2016, Remy Shen and Audrey Louvet were arrested for their roles in Patrick's death. Remy received 30 years in prison for murder, and Audrey was sentenced to 12 years for acting as an accessory to the kidnapping. One afternoon in early September of 2004, 20-year-old Derek Keeper sat at a desk in the newspaper lab at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, furiously typing on one of the school's desktop computers. The lab that Derek was in was the hub of the university's school paper, the Daily Nebraskan. So there were some other students who were in the space that were talking or working at other computers. But Derek didn't notice any of them. He was completely locked in on what he was doing and writing as fast as he could. Because after he was done with the article that he was working on, he had a ton of other responsibilities that he needed to tackle. So Derek was involved in a lot of stuff at school. He was in a fraternity, he was a senator in the student government, he was a research assistant for the library, and he was pursuing 5 different majors. And Derek took all of his various commitments very, very seriously. But the column he was currently writing was really the one he had the most fun with. So Derek was from a small city in Nebraska, and even though he'd always been, personally a very loud and opinionated person, he'd never had a real platform for talking about all the ideas and points of views that he had. And so this column really gave him the opportunity to finally, actually present these big ideas to the students at school, and he hoped would likely provoke lively discussions around campus about his ideas. After all, Derek loved a good debate, and so he would intentionally choose to write about really complex issues that would get his readers fired up, like the ongoing war in Iraq and the future of the Republican Party and all the things that were wrong with local politics. The tone he went for when he wrote and talked about these kind of, contentious things was often very sarcastic, very blunt, and provocative. I mean, he really thrived on creating discourse and getting people to passionately disagree with him. And they usually definitely did, to the point where some even would get very mad with him. A lot of times the paper's readers would write furious letters or even send hate mail about what Derek had written. But Derek was really not bothered by that at all. In some ways, that was his aim, to get people all riled up. And he was sure that the article he was writing right now was going to be even more divisive than really anything else he had written. For Derek, though, really for him, it was all about individual freedoms and encouraging people to say no to government overreach in their daily lives. I mean, that really was sort of his general stance on everything. That's really what inspired him to do any of this in the first place. In fact, this particular column that Derek was writing was about how he was advocating for abolishing a set of state and federal laws that were trying to control personal choice and the right to decide what was best for one's body, and he was against it. Now, to be clear, the stakes for this issue were life and death. I mean, literally. But Derek believed that the fundamental freedom of being an American was the right to make your own decisions, even if it meant risking your own personal safety. And so as Derek sort of furiously typed away, he was encouraging everyone, like senators and politicians, everybody, to have the same kind of intensity that he had about this issue, to be just fully bought in on this idea of, as Americans, we need individual freedom. And then finally, when he was all done typing, Derek sat back and proofread the whole thing, and when he got to the last line, he got chills. It said, quote, "I just wish we could keep the government out of our pocketbooks and out of our personal decisions." Derek loved that line, and so he nodded, satisfied with his work. He had nailed it. Then he emailed his draft to his editor with a big smile on his face. Derek's article went to print just a few days later, on September 17th. And like most of Derek's other articles, this one for sure got a lot of angry emails and letters from people who disagreed with what Derek had to say. But all the vitriol in these messages just proved to Derek that his article had clearly been a success. He had sparked outrage and got people talking about this issue. Derek even hoped that maybe some of the readers got angry enough to actually take action. That's what he wanted. He wanted his writing to genuinely inspire. The rest of Derek's semester was a total blur. He kept writing his weekly column on top of all of his other obligations and exams and everything else, and before he knew it, the semester was over, and he was headed to his mother's house in Texas for Christmas break. A few weeks later, on January 4th, 2005, at 3 a.m., Derek rode in the back seat of a Ford Explorer SUV on his way back to school after the break. He'd caught a ride from his mother's home in Texas with two of his fraternity brothers who were sitting up front. And Derek had spent the first part of this just awful 13-hour-long drive doing what he did best, using his sarcasm to make his friends laugh, and he was also engaging them in really animated conversations. And so, the first 6 to 8 hours had sort of flown by. But now, it's basically the middle of the night still, / very early morning, and everybody had just gone quiet because they were all exhausted from this truly awful, long drive. All any of them wanted to do at this point was just get back to campus and be done. And eventually, Derek and his friends were very close to campus. They were finally in Nebraska, and they were driving down Interstate 80, which was a snowy, cold highway not far from the school. And Derek was really excited to start the new semester. He'd had a nice, laid-back holiday where he'd caught up on sleep and spent a lot of time just kind of hanging out and seeing his younger siblings. But Derek just was not the kind of person who liked slowing down for very long. And so he was quite eager to get back to his busy life on campus. Especially, he really wanted to get back to his column. He had had a lot of downtime and was able to, brainstorm and come up with some good potential new topics for the column. But he really wasn't sure if any of those ideas were going to top, the very controversial article that he had published back in September. People were still talking about that one. And Derek was still thinking about it too. In fact, his own words and advice to his readers were still ringing in his ears and guiding his everyday decisions. But for now, Derek just leaned his head up against the cold glass window of the car and waited for this long trip to finally be over. But suddenly, he felt the SUV lurch. And before he knew what was happening, he heard a deafening bang and he heard his friends screaming. Just minutes later, a police officer was flying down Interstate 80 in his cruiser. Eventually, he spotted a group of ambulances parked on the side of the road, and he knew that's where he needed to go, so he pulled over to the side and stopped. And when he got out, he saw in a ditch just off the highway was an overturned SUV. The officer immediately jumped out of his cruiser and rushed towards the vehicle. And when he got there, he found the scene was just absolutely chaotic. There were a team of paramedics who were at the window of the SUV trying to assess the condition of the victims inside and to get them out. And when the officer kneeled down to look inside as well, he could clearly see two people inside the vehicle. Now, both of them seemed basically fine beyond, obviously being in a wreck. I mean, they were banged up and clearly dazed, but their injuries didn't look immediately life-threatening. So, sort of relieved, the officer backed away to let the paramedics do their thing. But very quickly, the officer noticed that more paramedics were actually running past the SUV to something on the ground a few feet beyond it. And so the officer followed them to go see what it was they were running to. And when he saw what was on the ground, the officer just kind of stopped and knew instinctively that there was nothing anybody could do. I mean, there was a body of a young man on the ground who clearly was a third passenger of this SUV, but their body was just mangled almost beyond recognition. It would turn out Derek had been right. His September 17th, highly contentious column in the Daily Nebraskan would be his most controversial and famous piece ever. And actually, people are still talking about it today. Because his column was about how, we, all us Americans, reserve the right to make our own choices about our bodies and personal safety. And Derek believed that there was a law that was actually directly infringing on that right, which was the law that was forcing people to wear a seatbelt. Derek despised this requirement. He thought seatbelts should be just a personal decision about safety. To him, it was not just about buckling up, it was about individual choice, about freedom. And on January 4th, that SUV that Derek was riding in going back to school, well, the driver hit some ice on the road and lost control. The driver and the other passenger in the front were wearing seatbelts. But Derek, in keeping with his beliefs, was not. And so when the SUV crashed and flipped over, Derek alone was killed. As one reporter pointed out, Derek lived by his beliefs, and he also died by them. Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the West Coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you gotta act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballenstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all expenses paid for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/Mr. Ballen. That is fandiem.com/Mr. Ballen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, January 13th, 2012, 51-year-old Francesco Scatino and his girlfriend, Dominica, sat at a table in a crowded restaurant at a resort in Italy. And they'd been there for a while, having a leisurely meal. So their table was covered with empty dishes, a wine decanter, and plates with the remnants of their amazing food. Now, having an extended, indulgent dinner like this one was not technically allowed, since Francesco was actually working. But Francesco was not too worried about breaking what he considered to be a small rule, because he was not just some hired hand. I mean, he was in charge of this entire resort on Italy's Tuscan coast. And the resort was amazing. It was literally right out on the water and had thousands of guest rooms and 6 restaurants with over a dozen bars, a theater, multiple swimming pools, and there was even a casino. So it had really a huge capacity for guests. And right now, there were easily more than 3,000 people staying at this resort. And Francesco was, very proud to be the boss of this place, this unbelievable place. He actually had started working at this resort as a security guard, but he'd worked his way up to the very top. And now he'd been overseeing this property for about 6 years. And being a leader really worked well for his personality, because he loved being impressive and feeling important. He'd heard staff and former coworkers complain about how he was too over the top and a bit of a show-off, so he'd heard those things. But Francesco knew that really these people, they were just jealous. He was handsome, he had a great job, and he had 2 just beautiful, amazing women in his life when, some people didn't have any. And so now Francesco smiled at one of his girlfriends, Dominica, who sat across the table from him and enjoying the dessert they were sharing. Francesco was married, but recently, Dominica had become the most important woman in his life. She was a dancer, and to him, she was just perfect. They'd only met a few weeks ago, so they were still in the honeymoon phase, where they were both still very flirtatious and eager to impress one another. And so right now, Francesco knew he should leave and get back to his managing duties, but he was having so much fun with Dominica, so he lingered, eating his dessert as slowly as he could. But as he sat there, slow playing his dessert, he realized, their night together didn't actually have to end just because the dinner was over. There was something he could do right now that would give them maybe another hour or so together. And it would also completely blow Dominica away and prove to her just how amazing he really was. So suddenly, with a big smile on his face, he told Dominica to hurry up, finish eating, because they needed to get upstairs immediately. A few minutes later, Francesco and Dominica hurried into the resort's top floor operations center. And just like the entire rest of the place, this room, despite being an operations center, was still just massively impressive. In addition to all the very new age, high-speed monitors and security feeds and maps all over the room, there was this huge window that overlooked this balcony, this exterior balcony, that looked down on the ocean. It was like this beautiful view of the ocean, and it even overlooked a stretch of small seaside villages called Giglio. This room was also filled with all of Francesco's employees hustling around and, staring at screens and talking on headsets. But as soon as Francesco and Dominica walked in there, Francesco kind of went to the center of the room and kind of got everybody's attention and told them all to listen up. Then he went over the details of his big idea. The resort was going to put on a very specific and spectacular kind of show called a salute. And they were going to do it right now. So salutes were very popular in this area of Italy, and Francesco's resort actually did them all the time, so this was not totally unusual. They were basically kind of a performance, mostly for the locals, where the resort would flash all of its lights and play music, while guests of the resort would go to their balconies and wave and cheer to the residents and the other tourists in Giglio. But critically, salutes needed to be both quick and highly choreographed. That's really the only way they worked. And so in order for a salute to work, it really required the attention and active participation from a large number of people. This was a big to-do. And so given the fact that these were sort of a big endeavor, it meant that, something could go wrong if you're not really careful. And Francesco actually had a mentor who'd actively discouraged him to not do these salutes or try to do as few as you can because of the fact that things could go wrong. But Francesco's mentor was not physically here right now to tell Francesco to stop. And the people that were here were pretty excited about his idea. So Francesco began going over the plan with his staff. And As he expected, with such a complicated undertaking, there were a lot of logistics to look over. However, when Francesco actually started going about these preparations, he realized he couldn't actually read anything because he didn't have his glasses on. He didn't think he looked handsome with them on, so he hadn't brought them out to dinner with Dominica, but now he really needed them. But thinking on his feet, Francesco simply asked a staff member to read him whatever information he really needed to know in order to do this salute. And so the staff member did as they were told, and at the end of it, Francesco felt like he had heard what he needed to hear and he thought everything was in order, and so he nodded and said, "Okay, we are all set to begin." And then he looked over at Dominica and smiled and sort of nodded like, "Okay, here we go." Then she knew whatever was coming next was going to be really, really special. When Francesco gave the actual order to begin the salute, everybody in the operations room jumped into action. And as soon as the actual salute began, Francesco squinted out the huge window that looked out over the ocean and Giglio down below, and Francesco was just so excited when he thought about how everyone who was out and about in town would look up and see his palace all lit up and full of life and energy. But as he peered at the lights of Giglio, he realized something wasn't quite right. Even without his glasses on, he could see that there was something outside in the darkness, just barely illuminated by the town's lights. It was a large shape right between the resort and Giglio. And to his horror, Francesco realized it was actually getting closer, fast. At the same time, but on the other side of the resort, an American man named Brian Aho was eating dinner with his wife and teenage daughter at the Milano restaurant, which was one of 6 restaurants in the resort. And they'd just been enjoying their meal when there was this deafening banging sound, and the entire room gave a huge jolt and everything inside just sort of went flying. Brian grabbed the table to brace himself as plates and glasses shot off the table and shattered everywhere. And then he heard screams and people hitting the ground all around him as diners were literally being thrown from their chairs. And then there was another series of crashes when some ceiling panels fell from above and smashed onto the ground. But then it was over. The shaking abruptly stopped, and Brian immediately jumped up to make sure that his wife and daughter were okay, and they did seem fine, just dazed like everybody else in the room. As Brian stood up, he could tell he was, mostly okay, also shaken up. But the overwhelming thought was just having no idea what had just happened. I mean, he's looking around and no one seemed to know. It had felt like some kind of earthquake or something. But then Brian thought, if this had been an earthquake, he really had to get his family out of this restaurant immediately in case of aftershocks. But it seemed like all the other diners clearly had the same idea, because before Brian could actually move, there was a surge of activity around him as dozens of people just began rushing towards the exit of the restaurant. And Brian didn't want him or his family to get caught in the middle of this huge crowd. Huge amounts of people running in the exact same direction, a panicked group of people, could easily create a stampede. And he was worried that he and his family could get pulled to the ground and trampled in the chaos. So he looked around and he saw on the other side of the restaurant there was a smaller door that nobody else was going to. So he and his family began making their way over to it. But before they could actually get through this door, the overhead lights began to flicker and then went out. And then with the darkness, suddenly came the blast of emergency alarms echoing through the resort. And then he could hear more screams, not just inside of this restaurant, but sort of all over the place. It was like the resort had devolved into madness. Brian had never been more scared in his whole life. I mean, his pulse was racing faster than he thought was even possible, and he almost felt paralyzed, like this was just too much to even process. He also, like basically everybody else, had no clue what was going on here. But I mean, navigating his family through an emergency was already going to be horrifying and terrifying and dangerous, but now he would also have to do it in the dark. For a moment, Brian and his family just stood there, kind of frozen in the dark. And then Brian was about to tell his family to just go through the door, we'll figure it out in the dark. But then luckily, the emergency lights came on, giving the room sort of a dim, eerie glow. But it was enough to sort of guide their way. And so at that point, Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his wife and his daughter, pushed through the side door, and headed out into the hallway. It would take nearly 10 minutes for Brian and his family to navigate the maze of hallways they had just walked into until finally they stepped outside and were in the open air. But when they finally got out there, Brian realized they actually had a really big problem, because the exit they had just taken had taken them not to safety. It had led them to this expansive outdoor terrace with a railing on the 4th floor of the resort, which meant they still needed to get down multiple levels in order to, evacuate safely. But just the fact they were on the 4th floor was not the big issue. The big issue was the terrace was clearly packed with other people from the resort who were also trying to evacuate. There was all these people basically blocking their way. So basically, everybody who has no idea what's going on is just like pushing and shoving each other, and there were no authority figures or any staff around to actually direct what now was basically an evacuation. And Brian could tell that the crowd was clearly starting to panic, and really he was too. Everybody was just like, what's happening here? And so Brian was about to suggest to his family that they try to find another way out when they heard the crackling of the resort's public speaker system, and a voice came on that finally delivered some information about what was happening. It said that there had been an electrical blackout, but everything was fine, and technicians were hard at work trying to fix the problem. So in the meantime, all the guests should stay calm and just go to their rooms for safety. And at this point, it was very obvious that the mood all around Brian and his family completely changed. People stopped pushing and arguing and panicking, and Brian himself felt that knot of dread in his stomach sort of loosen a bit. I mean, an electrical blackout didn't seem like a life or death situation, so he, and clearly everybody else, felt a whole lot less scared. Pretty much right away, many of the guests began heading back inside, making their way to their rooms. And Brian actually spotted a few staff members who were in the crowd, encouraging people to do just that, go back to your rooms. And so for a few moments, Brian and his family and the others just kind of stayed put and just kind of let things play out, kind of watching things settle back into normal. But then it was like with no warning, there was this other huge banging sound, and the floor once again buckled under Brian's feet. And this triggered a whole new wave of just absolute chaos out on this terrace. All at once, everybody started shouting and pushing each other in pure panic. And at the same time, there were all these new announcements coming out frantically over the loudspeaker, but it wasn't doing anything. It was like the crowd had decided something bad is happening and no one can tell me otherwise. I have to leave. Everybody is just trying to evacuate all at once. And so pretty much right at this point, you had a group of people who were out on the terrace who decided to charge into the resort to try to find another way to evacuate. And also you had the group of people who had already gone back inside to go back to their rooms, who had changed their mind, who charged right back out, back onto the terrace. And so for a moment, it was like these two pools of people kind of smashing into each other, and Brian and his family were kind of off to the side because they had just barely stepped out onto the terrace when all of this stuff was happening. But then Brian watched in complete shock as he saw some of the people, after they pushed through all the way to the edge of the terrace to the railing, they began climbing over the railing to climb down from the 4th floor. Seeing this was horrifying for Brian, but then he felt yet another shudder under his feet and a loud industrial groaning sound from the resort right behind him, and he knew if he didn't do what these people were doing, he and his family might not be able to evacuate. Clearly, there was a real problem. They didn't know what it was, but they had to go. So he grabbed his wife and his daughter's hands, he shoved his way through the crowd to the railing, over the railing they went, and down they began to climb. Meanwhile, back up in the top-level operations center, Francesco was staring out the room's huge window, just completely frozen in shock. His resort was in complete pandemonium. Below, guests were running, others were fighting and shoving, and some were literally leaping to their potential deaths from the upper-level balconies and terraces. And so as Francesco watched all of this carnage, he tried to wrap his head around how the night had gone so horrifically wrong. The worst part of all of it was there was absolutely no way to fix it. He'd been trying to show Dominica and everybody else how amazing and impressive and in control he was, but he'd completely lost control of this whole situation. And he'd also lost his girlfriend because Dominica had quickly fled the resort. And then there was a loud crashing sound somewhere in the distance, and his heart pounded, and he realized it was time for him to start running too. Minutes later, Francesco and some of his staff sprinted through the halls of the resort. And as they ran, thunderous noises and bangs came from every direction, and debris from the ceiling and walls crashed to the ground all around them as they were shaken loose. And all the while, over the noise, Francesco could hear the continuous shrieks of panic from people who were still clearly trapped inside the resort and just couldn't get out. But he and the others he was with finally did make it to the exit. And this exit was not overrun with panicking people. So Francesco was lucky enough to be able to pretty quickly make it to the bottom level and then keep on going. And he did not look back, not until he was far away and definitely to safety. But when he did finally stop running, and he did turn around and looked back at his resort, his stomach pitched so hard he nearly vomited. Because finally, he could see right in front of him the full, horrible extent of what he had done. It would turn out what Francesco was looking at was the culmination of a record number of terrible choices he had made that night. 1. Francesco would later deny this, but he was seen drinking alcohol at dinner while he was supposed to be working. 2. He was not wearing his glasses, which meant he was his most handsome self, but also that he couldn't see very well. And 3. He was distracted by his new girlfriend, who he had brought to an area where only key personnel were allowed because he was desperate to impress her. Now, in most workplaces, this would all just be considered unprofessional and maybe might get you fired. But in Francesco's workplace, it was much worse than that. What he had done was incredibly dangerous because the resort that Francesco managed was not a regular hotel. It was a gigantic cruise ship called the Costa Concordia. Francesco was its captain, and when he issued the order for the boat to do a salute, he was not just ordering a complicated but entertaining show. A cruise ship salute also involves steering the massive boat much closer to shore than usual to appropriately show off to the locals on land. But because Francesco literally couldn't see very well, was obviously distracted and possibly drunk, he didn't notice that when they did this salute, they were going way too fast and way too close to shore. That shape he saw rushing towards them in the darkness was an enormous cluster of rocks. By the time he saw it, it was too late. The Concordia had smashed into the rocks, tearing a 230-foot wide hole in the hull, which immediately flooded the ship. And then making matters even worse, Francesco delayed rescue efforts for more than an hour by trying to convince people that what had happened was just an electrical outage. And then when he finally did issue an evacuation order, he broke a sacred rule for ship captains. He fled the boat before the remainder of his crew and the passengers. Like he was the first one off. He did not go down with his ship. That American passenger, Brian Aho, and his family would survive, because after they decided to go over the railing, they, perilously climbed down 4 levels all the way to a lifeboat, and so they survived. But unfortunately, 32 other people who were on board the boat ultimately died, all because of Francesco's desire to show off. Francesco himself was ultimately arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He was subsequently named Italy's most hated man. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Both of today's stories are about people who actually achieved their big career ambitions, but at an extremely high cost. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's nasal spray with super glue. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of June 10, 1871, a defense attorney named Clement Vallandigham sat in a courtroom in Lebanon, Ohio, listening intently as a prosecutor questioned a witness. And with each word that this witness said on the stand, it made the knot in Clement's stomach get tighter and tighter, because this testimony was very bad for Clement's client, an accused murderer named Thomas McGeehan. So the murder that McGeehan was on trial for had happened about 6 months earlier on Christmas Eve in the nearby city of Hamilton. That night, McGeehan had stormed into a saloon with a group of men and attacked another man named Tom Myers. And at some point during this attack, a gun went off and Tom Myers was shot and killed. Now, there were at least 30 witnesses in the saloon at the time, but the whole attack had happened so fast and was so chaotic that no one had seen who did the actual shooting. Despite that, everyone in town immediately decided that McGeehan had done it. However, even Clement had to admit that that was a reasonable assumption. McGeehan and the victim, Tom Myers, had a long-standing feud, and everyone knew they hated each other. Also, McGeehan was a well-known violent criminal who was said to have killed at least 4 other people. So, when Tom Myers got killed, the citizens of Hamilton didn't even wait for a trial. They wanted to hang McGeehan right now. Now, the police had obviously intervened and arrested McGeehan instead, but word had spread all over Ohio about how messy and dramatic this case was. And as a result, the trial itself had become very high profile. Every day, journalists and important people from all over the state came to sit in court and listen to the testimony. And now, all of these important people were watching Clement's defense case get just obliterated by this witness. The witness was one of the men who had been in the saloon at the time of the murder, and he was making a very big claim. He was saying that even though no one in the saloon saw McGeehan fire the gunshot that killed Tom Myers, he must have. Because after the gun went off, this witness saw smoke coming from McGeehan's jacket pocket, like he had been concealing his gun inside his jacket when he had fired it. Clement looked around the courtroom while the witness explained this and saw that everybody was nodding, like what the witness said made perfect sense. Clement could tell basically at this point, everybody thought his client was guilty. But Clement? He did not agree. He knew McGeehan's case looked bad, but Clement was absolutely certain that his client really was innocent. Clement's theory was that the victim, Tom Myers, had shot himself by accident when he pulled out his own gun during the fight to defend himself. Unfortunately for Clement, though, this was 1871, so there was no forensic evidence about gunshots except for some scorch marks on Tom Myers' shirt. So the whole entire case was really just based on witness testimony. And of course, this witness was very convincing for the other side. The prosecutor finished up his questioning and then walked back to his seat with a smirk on his face, like he knew what he had just done. They pretty much had just won the case. It was now Clement's turn with the witness, and he really didn't know how it was going to go. But as Clement stood up and crossed the courtroom floor, he felt a calm come over him, because he was thinking to himself, I don't have much to lose. I mean, pretty much everybody thinks my client is guilty. And so if he's found guilty, no one's going to be shocked. But, maybe I can find a way to prove he's innocent, and that would be just great. But if I don't, it is what it is. So to be clear, Clement was a very controversial figure in Ohio at this time, which was right after the Civil War. He had been very vocally against the then president, Abraham Lincoln, and his viewpoints had gotten him banished from Ohio and the other northern states. And then after the war ended, he had returned to his home state of Ohio and had gone back to being an attorney. But he had never really been able to fully rehabilitate his public image. Even now, 6 years later, a lot of people still really hated him for behavior during the war. And so, in essence, Clement knew that pretty much his public profile was not about to change if he lost this case. I mean, basically nothing would change. He's the guy that everybody hates, and his client's the murderer. It is what it is. But if he won, he could recreate himself in the court of public opinion as a sensational criminal defense lawyer who overturned impossible cases. And again, he really believed his client was innocent, so this would be like a two-pronged major victory for Clement. And so Clement stepped up to the witness box and began firing off questions to this witness. By the end of the day, Clement had gotten that witness to admit he hadn't actually seen a physical gun. And eventually, Clement was able to completely destroy the jacket shooting theory when he showed the court that the jacket that McGeehan had been wearing that night, there was no hole anywhere on it. As the week went on and more witnesses took the stand, Clement was pleased to find that none of them had any actual proof that McGeehan shot Tom Myers. But he also couldn't find any evidence that proved his client was innocent either. So later that week, on Friday, June 16th, as the trial came to a close, Clement was kind of worried. I mean, he knew that he had not done enough to get his client acquitted, and even though he knew that the likelihood of success here was always going to be slim, he felt like he had begun to make some serious headway, and they could win. Victory felt possible, and it was just slipping out of his hand. That afternoon, Clement sat behind the defense table, sweating profusely as he listened to the prosecutor's team deliver their just brutal closing arguments. This was giving Clement a lot of anxiety. I mean, he was moments away from giving his own closing arguments, and it was really his very last chance to convince the jury that his client was innocent. But he just did not feel like the speech he had prepared would do that, especially after, the prosecutor's really just very powerful speech that he was giving right now. And so as the prosecutor very eloquently and beautifully wrapped up his speech, Clement was busy furiously crossing out lines on his speech and rewriting things and trying to make it better, but he just couldn't. So he just sat there, racking his brain on what to say. But as he was sitting there in silence, and like the prosecutor has sat down and everybody's waiting for Clement to stand up and deliver his speech here, an idea suddenly hit Clement. It hit him so hard that he actually just dropped his pen. He didn't know why this idea hadn't occurred to him earlier, but he suddenly realized there was a way he could prove McGeehan was innocent. It was so obvious. And if he was right, he would go down in history as probably the greatest defense attorney Ohio had ever seen. And so Clement, he lunged for his pen again, and he frantically scribbled down what he was thinking. And then a minute later, he heard the judge call his name and tell him, "Come on, it's your turn to speak." And so Clement, he shot to his feet and he cleared his throat. And instead of launching into the speech he had prepared for this moment, he asked the judge to let him do it instead on Monday. The judge was a little apprehensive, but eventually they agreed. And when they did, Clement felt a surge of excitement rush through his body. And after the court proceedings officially ended for the day, Clement could not get out of there fast enough. Clement waited until nightfall to act. He needed to run a test to make sure his theory he was going to employ on Monday was correct. But he didn't want anybody from the prosecution team to see him doing it. So after dinner, Clement slipped out of his hotel and into the quiet streets of Lebanon. He'd spent the last few hours having dinner with some friends. And while he was pretty vague about what he actually planned to do tonight, he did tell them that they really needed to stay in town long enough to hear his big final argument on Monday. He was so confident in what he'd uncover tonight doing this test that he was sure his speech on Monday would be like the greatest legal moment in the history of Ohio. And so now, as Clement made his way to the edge of town, he was filled with adrenaline and kept increasing his speed until he was basically running. And then he finally arrived at a quiet, isolated part of Lebanon. And as soon as he got there, he set up for this test he had planned and then ran through it. And after he finished, Clement smiled because he knew he had just found a way to prove that his client was innocent. Just a few minutes later, around 9 p.m., and Clement was back inside of his hotel room. He was so excited about the results of his test that he couldn't even sit down. And so he just kept pacing around and trying to get his thoughts together, but he was just so excited. His hotel room door was cracked open, and as he paced around, he saw his co-counsel, who was another lawyer on the defense team, walk by. So this hotel was sort of like the home base of everyone who was in town for the trial. And so most of the prosecution and the defense teams were staying there. When Clement saw his co-counsel, he immediately waved him inside and tried to tell him what he'd figured out. But the words just kind of tumbled out, and all he really got across was that the prosecution had it all wrong, but he, Clement, had figured it out. But his co-counsel was just looking at him like he really didn't understand what he was saying. And so at some point, Clement realized he really needed to do a physical demonstration here. He really needed to repeat the test he had just done to actually show the co-counsel exactly what he was talking about. So without a whole lot of explanation to his co-counsel, Clement got up, he set up the test, and then he turned and he told his co-counsel to watch carefully. And then Clement began to perform the test. But this time, during the test, there was a sudden explosion and Clement collapsed to the ground. It would turn out that Clement's test did prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that his client really was innocent. His theory was that Tom Myers shot himself by fumbling with his own gun, but in order to make sure his theory held weight with the jury, he wanted to show everyone that it was definitely physically possible to do that. So when Clement had gone to the edge of town to do this test by himself for the first time, he took a gun with him, and he basically experimented with ways it could have actually happened by shooting the gun through fabric from different angles and looking at the resulting scorch marks. And when he did this, he realized that the scorch marks that had been left on the victim's clothes, the only forensic evidence they had, they could have only been made if the victim was shot at point-blank range, which meant that McGeehan was standing too far away to be the shooter. But it was not until later, when Clement acted out the shooting again for his co-counsel, that his discovery went from great to perfect, because completely by accident, he did exactly what Tom Myers had done. He fumbled with the gun and shot himself. Clement died from his self-inflicted wound 12 hours later. But his death made his argument so convincing that his client was eventually acquitted. So Clement had been right. This was the greatest case of his life. It was also his last. And when you get to the end of this story, you'll see why. On an overcast, chilly Sunday in the fall of 1932, 32-year-old composer Rezo Sharesh sat in his apartment in Paris trying to write a new melody. He'd been at it for hours, and it was not going well at all. Each time he jotted down a new combination of notes, he'd just tear it up and toss it into his trash bin, where there was already a pile of other discarded drafts. So Rezo was used to this kind of messy creative process. He had made a name for himself as a musician in his home country of Hungary over the last decade. He'd written more than 40 musical compositions for various singers and artists, and a few had been really successful. So Rezo knew he had the talent to be a huge star and to change people's lives with his music. But recently, despite trying many different iterations and just allowing the messy creative process to take hold and just kind of letting it run its course, Rezo still just could not come up with any new good work. Mainly because he was incredibly stressed out. So at this point in 1932, Rezo and many other people were very nervous about the state of the world and their future, because there were really violent political views spreading across Europe, especially in Germany. This was still 7 years before the start of World War II, but Hitler and his Nazi party were already starting to gain power. And Rezo, who was Jewish, was worried about all the anti-Jewish rhetoric that the Nazis were spreading. And while that was terrifying and kept Rezo up at night, the more urgent worry he had on a daily basis that was really impeding his creativity was how to literally afford food, because the world was also in the middle of the Great Depression, which was a period of time in the 1920s and 30s when multiple countries were dealing with terrible economies and mass unemployment. Back in Rezo's home country of Hungary, things were especially bad and getting worse. Banks and businesses were closing almost every day, and more than a quarter of the population was unemployed, living in extreme poverty. Rezo had moved to Paris so he could find more opportunities. Paris, after all, was the art mecca of Europe. And even though the state of the world felt depressing, Rezo thought that the creative energy there would inspire him to create something beautiful amid all the darkness. But now, Rezo sighed and leaned back to look around the tiny, drafty Parisian apartment of his. He'd been here for months, and his fortunes certainly had not changed. He still didn't have any work, and he still could not seem to write anything good. But, Rezo, he kept leaning back over and trying to write, but it was like immediately he would tear it up, and he was just getting more and more frustrated. Until finally, he just did give up and put his head in his hands and basically said, "I can't do this." It seemed like the harder he worked and the harder he tried to ignore all the despair and sadness and awful things going on in the world, the worse he felt, and obviously the worse his work was. Like right now, he actually almost felt physically ill from kind of bottling up all these competing terrible feelings and thoughts. But as he thought about the fact that he was doing that, he suddenly decided he just can't do that anymore. He can't continue to keep that stuff in. It was at that moment that Rezo exhaled and let in all the anguish he'd been trying to push away. Sadness and fear and quiet desperation just washed over him and into him, and he didn't fight it anymore. He just suddenly started writing. His pen flew across the page as wave after wave of terrible emotion hit him. And when he was done, he ran over to his piano to play the notes that he had just written. And as his fingers moved across the keys, a very slow, sad melody began to fill the air. And it was so beautiful and so sad that he actually felt like crying as he heard it. When he was done playing, he just sat back in his chair, and now tears filled his eyes, and his heart was pounding so fast that he knew he needed to get some air fast, or he might actually just pass out. And so Rezo went outside to take a walk and hoped the fresh air would help him snap out of the wild emotional fog that had just come over him. But the Paris streets were gray and cold, and this new melody continued to ring in his ears. He was thrilled that he'd actually written something real and powerful for the first time in what felt like a long time. But it was such an intense expression of his own sadness that it almost hurt. Shortly into his walk, he heard somebody call his name. When he looked up, he saw it was his good friend, a poet named Laszlo Yavor, who rushed right up to him. And right away, when Rezo saw his friend, he felt himself lightening up a little bit. He liked Laszlo. They were both Hungarians in Paris trying to make good art and a name for themselves, but neither of them had really done it yet. But as soon as Laszlo reached Rezo could tell that his friend seemed really upset about something too. And his friend told him that his fiancée had just ended things with him, and he was completely heartbroken. After Rezo said that he was terribly sorry, the men just walked together in silence. They were both lost in their own sad, heavy feelings, and neither of them could think of anything to say. And without even meaning to, Rezo just began whistling the song that he had just written. And when he did this, it was like the tune had an immediate effect on Laszlo. His eyes welled up and he sort of began to cry, and also he began to sing along, using words from a very sad poem that he had recently written. Rezo couldn't believe it, because without even trying, Laszlo's words were perfectly fit for his melody. And so as this sort of impromptu collaboration has begun, the men went from this really dark, gloomy mood to a purely excited one. They were so inspired that they rushed into a nearby restaurant to sit and work out the rest of the song. And before they knew it, Rezo had written an entire composition with Laszlo's lyrics. And the song was about someone whose lover had just died and their desire to be reunited with them. When the men finished, they wanted to hear their song out loud. So they asked the restaurant's resident musicians to play it. And pretty soon, their song, something that hadn't even existed a few hours ago, was blaring around the crowded restaurant. And as far as Rezo and Laszlo could tell, everybody inside was loving this song. Some of the restaurant patrons actually cried, and others closed their eyes and just kind of swayed to the sound. It was what Rezo had always hoped his music would do, which was truly affect those who heard it. Rezo and Laszlo looked at each other, and for the first time in days, they smiled. Rezo and Laszlo decided to call their song Gloomy Sunday, since it had been created on that hazy fall Sunday. They both had a feeling that this tune was very special, and that it would finally be the thing that changed both of their lives. So, over the next few months, they took the song around to producers and tried to get somebody to buy it. And finally, someone did. A company agreed to publish the sheet music and record it. After that, Rezo went back to his shabby Parisian apartment and waited for the song to take hold and the money to start pouring in. But that's not what happened. As the months passed by, Rezo didn't hear Gloomy Sunday on the radio, or see it on any charts, or hear it in restaurants, or performed in theaters. It was like it really had never existed at all. And this crushed Rezo. He was even more upset and defeated than he had been before he had written it, because he'd gotten a taste of hope, and it felt even worse to fail after that. The rest of Rezo's life and the state of the world got worse too. The Great Depression was still going strong, and as Hitler got more and more popular, people started to wonder if there was going to be a war. So Rezo and pretty much everyone else around him just sank further into their fears and worries and kept praying for something to change. Three years later, on a spring evening in 1935, Rezo was back in Hungary, walking down a street in the country's capital city, Budapest. He was on his way to a friend's house But as he strode down the sidewalk, he heard a song coming from an open window. He stopped cold and his heart began to pound because he knew that song. It was his. It was Gloomy Sunday. Rezo had no idea how or why he was hearing his song, which as far as he knew, no one had really been that interested in. But it was completely shocking. I mean, someone he didn't know was listening to his song on the radio? That meant it was being put out on the airwaves and being consumed by the public. This was incredible. And so Rezo just stood there, letting his own notes wash over him for the first time, hearing this out in public. And then when it was done, he just stood there and just absolutely beamed. And after that, for months, Gloomy Sunday was everywhere. Rezo heard it played at social gatherings, streaming from people's windows, street performers sang it to passerby, and it was even performed at concert venues all over the city. And so by the end of the year, it seemed like there was hardly anyone in Hungary who hadn't heard and loved his song. Rezo even read in the papers that his song was being played in England, in France, and as far away as the United States. So Rezo knew that he had actually done it. He had realized his dream of being a successful, internationally recognized composer with a hit song that truly resonated with the public. A few months later, on a morning in late February of 1936, Rezo left his apartment and was heading out for the day. And on his way down the street, he passed by a newsstand, and he noticed that one of the headlines mentioned his song, Gloomy Sunday. Initially, he was really excited to see that he was getting some press, so he immediately grabbed a copy and opened it up to read. But as his eyes scanned the page, his stomach flipped because this was not good press. Actually, what this article had to say was so terrible that Rezo's first reaction was that he'd read it wrong. And so he read it again, and again, and again, but each time he read it, it just said the same horrible thing. And so Rezo found himself starting to panic. Rezo quickly shut the paper and just began looking around him. And he saw there were a few other people who were also by the newsstand, and they were reading the same paper. And they were all talking to one another in hushed voices and pointing at that headline about his song. And Rezo just stood there, listening to this unsettling murmur and feeling a wave of absolute horror wash over him. Over the next month, more and more headlines about Rezo's song continued to appear in the papers. And it was like each day, they only got worse. And then the story went international. I mean, the Catholic Church weighed in on it. And then the police got involved. Finally, one afternoon at the end of March in 1936, Rezo was sitting at his piano, staring down at the keys. He knew he should be writing music, but instead he was just filled with dread, just like he had been every day since he first read that dreadful headline. And then suddenly there was a knock at the door. And when Rezo got up and answered it, a cold sweat broke out all over his body because it was the Budapest police, and they wanted him to come down to the station. Rezo's pulse raced with nerves, but at this point he wasn't surprised, because by now he knew that writing Gloomy Sunday had been a horrific mistake. Because it would turn out Gloomy Sunday had been a very shockingly impactful song, just as Rezo thought he wanted it to be. But over the course of the last year, the police had begun finding its sheet music or its written lyrics or the actual song playing on record players at scenes of suicides. Dozens of people across Hungary, Europe, and the United States, from police officers to teenagers to waitstaff to students, had taken their own lives, basically while listening to Gloomy Sunday. These deaths were so widespread that a Hungarian archbishop actually wrote a letter to the general public begging them to stop hurting themselves. And multiple bans of the song itself were enacted across Europe and England and the United States. On the day that the Budapest police knocked on Rezo's door, they demanded that he stop sales of the song. And Rezo agreed. And eventually, so did the song's publisher and his musical partner Laszlo. And Rezo's partner Laszlo was especially grief-stricken by this whole thing, because his fiancée, the one who had broken his heart on the day he had written this song with Rezo, she ended up being one of the many suicide victims. Before she took her own life, she sent Laszlo a telegram which simply said, "Gloomy Sunday." No one knows why Gloomy Sunday potentially caused this sudden wave of death. One theory is that people were already really suffering from depression and feeling hopeless because of the Great Depression and the worsening political climate, and the song's popularity was either a coincidence or sort of an unfortunate trigger. As for Rezo, he was devastated by the legacy of his song, even though it did technically live up to his original vision. It did deeply resonate with people and was unquestionably a hit. And over the years, despite all the negative associations with the song, it's been translated into 28 different languages and was even performed by legendary singers like Frank Sinatra and Billie Holiday. Initially, there was an estimated 20 suicides attributed to Gloomy Sunday across Europe and the United States. In the years that have followed, however, lore around the song has only grown, and some estimates put the death toll in the hundreds, although the numbers are difficult to verify. Rezo never wrote another hit, and in fact, ultimately, he followed in the footsteps of some of his listeners. He jumped out the window of his 8th floor apartment on another overcast, gloomy Sunday and died 2 days later. Before I wrap this episode up, I want to say that if you are experiencing suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideations, or you're just struggling right now, number one, you're not alone, but number two, you really need to talk to someone. Don't hold that stuff in. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In June of 2005, a customer at a gas station in Derry, New Hampshire, carried a prepaid cell phone to the counter. They paid for it in cash, and then afterwards they went out to their car and cut open the packaging. Then once they had the phone, they dialed a number to activate it. But when the customer service rep asked for their name, the customer hesitated, because the whole reason they'd bought this prepaid phone in the first place was specifically so nobody could trace the calls back to their real identity. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to cook the like button a nice home-cooked meal. But be sure you first douse it in liquid laxative. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On an afternoon in June of 2005, a 57-year-old truck driver named Jack Reed took a sip of his margarita at a barbecue in a park in Derry, New Hampshire. Now, he usually didn't drink, but today he was celebrating. It was his daughter Megan's high school graduation party. And this was a big deal for Jack. He'd grown up in the foster care system with nothing, and he'd worked really hard to ensure that his kids were set up for a better life than he had. So he was just really proud of Megan for making the right choices and finishing school. Now he looked over and he saw Megan sitting at a picnic table with her brother, Jack Jr., and also their mother, Virginia. Even though he and Virginia were not together anymore, they were still on good terms, and he was glad the whole family could be there for this special occasion. But then Jack tensed up as he spotted somebody else who was walking across the grass toward them, Megan's boyfriend, Walter. So Megan and Walter had moved in together recently, and Jack was definitely not thrilled about it. He didn't have anything against Walter in particular, but his daughter was just 18 years old, and he thought that she was definitely too young to be living with a boyfriend. But Jack didn't want to pick a fight about it on a day like this. So instead, he actually got up and walked over to Walter and gave him a big friendly hug and said he was glad to see him. Then they both sat down at the table and joined the family's conversation, and as Jack took another sip of his margarita, he actually felt himself relax. That evening, after the party was over, Jack drove his car home and stopped at a gas station along the way. He parked at the pump, he went inside, and then passed the cashier a few bills for a tank of gas, and also a lottery ticket. Jack was a regular lottery player, and even though he'd never won anything particularly big, he was always hoping that one day he would hit the jackpot and strike it rich. So he put the ticket in his pocket and then went back outside and filled up his car. Then he got in his car and he drove a few more blocks to his home, which was a trailer parked behind a warehouse on the edge of town. And one big reason Jack chose to live here was because there was plenty of room to park all of his work vehicles, including a large red and black dump truck. After years of working as a truck driver, Jack had built his own trucking business from the ground up. He did garbage removal and moving and other odd jobs, and he was making a decent living. But he still lived frugally in his rented trailer so he could save up for retirement. His goal was to save enough so that in a couple of years, once Jack Jr. was done with school, he could leave the cold New Hampshire winters behind and move to sunny, beautiful Las Vegas. He'd gotten the idea a couple of years ago when he'd done a moving job for a local self-made millionaire who was moving from New Hampshire to Vegas. He saw the millionaire as a huge success story, and he believed that if he worked hard enough, or maybe got lucky enough, he could follow in this same path. Now, Jack got out of his car and he walked over to his trailer. He opened up the door and he went inside. He turned on the lights and he was just about to sit down to take off his shoes when he heard a noise outside. Immediately, he went to the window and pulled back the curtains and he looked outside into the woods behind the property, but he didn't see anything. Still, he felt his heart racing, and he actually had to take a few deep breaths to calm himself down. So almost 2 years ago, there'd been an incident where Jack heard someone creeping around outside his trailer. He'd grabbed his gun and went out to confront them, and he'd seen a man standing at the edge of the woods. The man had stared right at him and actually called out his name. Jack had actually fired his gun at this man, who then ran away into the woods and never came back. But Jack had never figured out what the encounter was about. As far as he knew, he didn't have any enemies, so it really just didn't make any sense. But again, since this strange guy was never caught, Jack was still very on edge whenever he heard strange noises outside and around his trailer. Now, as he looked out the window and he felt sure that there was nobody there, Jack closed the curtains and took the lottery ticket out of his pocket. He sat down at the table and he started scratching off the silver foil with a coin. And he was not a winner this time. But it didn't dampen his mood. Next time, he knew might be his lucky break. A couple of weeks later, on the morning of Monday, June 27th, Jack climbed up into his dump truck and rolled down the windows. It was already pretty hot outside, and he was on his way to the only job he had lined up for that day, a trash disposal gig that would likely only take a few hours. So he started the truck, and as he pulled out onto the road, his cell phone rang. He answered it, and a man spoke and said his name was Charlie, and that he had heard Jack did some work, hauling stuff away, and that, he had this new barn that really needed to be cleaned out, and could Jack do it? Jack said sure, he could actually do it that afternoon. And then he grabbed his logbook off the passenger seat, and he flipped to a blank page, and he scribbled down Charlie's name and address, which was in Deerfield, almost 30 miles away. Jack told Charlie he would let him know as soon as he was on the way, and then the two men hung up. Around 3 p.m. that afternoon, Jack drove down a very secluded 2-lane road in Deerfield. It was sweltering outside, and he was already exhausted and dripping with sweat from his trash disposal gig that morning. He had no idea what to expect going into this barn cleaning job with this guy Charlie, but he was hoping it wouldn't take too long. Jack slowed down as the trees to his right parted, and a gravel driveway appeared. He turned onto the driveway, and a few seconds later, he pulled up right outside of a white 2-story house with a big barn out back. Jack parked his dump truck and walked right up to the front door. He rang the doorbell, and a moment later, the door opened. 2 days later, on the afternoon of June 29th, Jack's daughter, Megan, and her boyfriend, Walter, walked up to the front door of Jack's trailer. Megan noticed that Jack's dump truck was not parked outside, which seemed wrong, and so she immediately felt this knot in her stomach. About an hour earlier, Megan had gotten a call from her mother, Virginia, saying that Jack had not shown up to a job that morning and he was not answering his phone. This was unlike him, so Megan had said that she and Walter would just go over to his trailer and make sure he was okay. Now, initially, Megan had assumed her dad had just overslept or maybe forgot about the job. But now, it looked like he'd actually left for work because the dump truck wasn't there, but never actually made it to the job. But nonetheless, Megan knocked on the trailer door, just to be sure her dad really wasn't home, and there was no answer. And so at this point, Megan called her mom to tell her what she had seen and, the fact that her dad wasn't here. And she also told her mom that she was starting to feel pretty worried. And then a few minutes later, Virginia pulled up in her car. Megan, Walter, and Virginia all just stayed there right at the trailer all afternoon, hoping that maybe Jack would just show up at some point. And the whole time they're calling him over and over again, but it just kept going straight to voicemail. And then finally, around 6:30 p.m., when still they had not seen or heard from Jack, they decided it was time to call the police. On Tuesday, July 5th, so 6 days after Jack was reported missing by his family, Derry Police Detective Mike Hoole pulled into the parking lot of a Target store about an hour's drive south in Saugus, Massachusetts. Hoole slowed down and began to slow roll through the rows of cars, keeping an eye out for one particular vehicle. Hool was in charge of Jack's missing persons case, which had not really been going anywhere so far. According to his family, the last time anybody had seen or heard from Jack was actually on June 27th, so 2 days before he was reported missing to the police. But his family could not think of anywhere Jack might have gone or anybody who might want to hurt him. So initially, Hool had figured that Jack must have just driven off for some time alone, and that he would just come home sooner or later. But that morning, he'd gotten another call from Jack's daughter, Megan. She said the family had put up all these missing posters around town for Jack, and somebody had called her and said they actually saw Jack's dump truck at this particular target in Saugus, more than 40 miles away from Derry. Now, this tip was unique enough that Hool decided he would just drive out and take a look for himself. And now, as he slowly made his way towards the back of this parking lot, he saw it, a red and black dump truck parked near the back corner. So Hool stopped his car and he walked over to look at this truck, and right away he saw the license plate confirmed this truck was definitely Jack's. When Hool peeked in the driver's side window, though, he didn't see anybody inside. But there were flies buzzing around the back of the truck, basically the open section of the dump truck. There was something in there the flies were attracted to. And there was also very clearly a rotten, awful smell wafting out of the back of this truck. And so Hool put on some gloves and he climbed up the side of the dump truck. Now, the actual bed of this dump truck was covered by a tarp. And so Hool grabbed the tarp and he pulled it back, but he still did not have an unobstructed view, because whatever was in the bed was also wrapped in plastic, and quite a bit of it. So he pulled out a knife and began cutting through the plastic. Less than an hour later, Detective Hool stood by as workers from the medical examiner's office loaded Jack's body into their van, and he was still wrapped up in plastic. Hool really wanted to get a look at Jack's body to figure out how he died, but that would require cutting through all the plastic that he was wrapped in. And Hool knew he needed to leave all that intact for evidentiary purposes. So he'd just have to wait until the autopsy to find out the cause of death here. But from the way Jack's body had been disposed of, hidden in a parking lot 40 miles from his house, Hool was already guessing that this was 1, a murder, and 2, it was carefully planned, probably by somebody that Jack knew. Hool had already found out from the family that Jack had 5 children with 2 different women, and so he figured there could be some hidden tensions between any of them. But he also thought the murder could be tied to Jack's business. Now, as far as Jack's family knew, everything Jack did with his business was above board. But it's entirely possible that he might have gotten involved with sketchy people, or maybe done something that made a client angry that the family didn't know about. Also, leaving Jack's dead body in the back of his own dump truck definitely seemed like a way to send a message. So, once the forensics team had taken photos and swabbed the truck for DNA and fingerprints, Hool pulled on a pair of latex gloves and opened up the driver's side door. There was no blood inside the cabin of the truck, no sign of a weapon, and really nothing that struck him as unusual or helpful. That is, until he saw the logbook that was tucked into a pocket on the passenger side door. He reached for it, pulled it out, and began to flip through it, and he saw there was a list of all of Jack's appointments, along with the names, addresses, and phone numbers of the clients who had hired him. The last job that was recorded in this book was on the morning of June 27th, back in Derry, where Jack lived. Now, there were no other jobs noted down for that day, but a couple of pages later, on an otherwise blank page, Hool found an entry that Jack seemed to have scribbled down in a rush. It was just an address, 145 North Road, no town listed, and the name was just Charlie for the client. Hool placed the logbook inside of an evidence bag and he sealed it. And then, as he sort of looked around the area, he noticed all the security cameras on light posts all over the parking lot, and there happened to be one that was pointing directly at Jack's truck. Did you know that the average employer has to sort through roughly 250 resumes per job opening? Talk about time consuming. Well, if you're hiring, here's some good news. You can now review all of these resumes and applications much faster thanks to ZipRecruiter. And today, you can even try it for free at ziprecruiter.com/Ballen. ZipRecruiter's powerful matching technology finds qualified candidates quickly. And with ZipRecruiter's new feature, qualified candidates who are very interested in your job show up at the top of your list. You also get a feel for their personality. Candidates can tell you in their own words why they're interested in your job. No wonder ZipRecruiter is the #1 rated hiring site based on G2. Cut through the standard and get to the standouts with ZipRecruiter. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. And now you can try it for free at ziprecruiter.com/Ballen. That's ziprecruiter.com/Ballen. Meet your match on ZipRecruiter. The next day, so Wednesday, July 6th, Hoole was back at the precinct in Derry, reading over an autopsy report that had just been sent over from the Massachusetts Medical Examiner. The description in the report said that Jack had been severely beaten. He had broken ribs, skull fractures, and a softball-sized hole in the side of his head. His face had been so mangled that they'd actually had to pull Jack's dental records to confirm that it was actually him. Hoole thought this level of violence definitely made this murder feel really personal, and it only made him more confident that Jack's killer or killers was somebody who knew him. Just then, Hoole heard a knock at his door, and he looked up as an officer peeked his head into Hoole's office and asked him to come take a look at something. So Hoole stood up from his desk, and he followed the officer down the hallway to another room where a team of investigators were poring over that security footage from the Target parking lot. Hoole watched over their shoulders as the investigators pulled up a specific clip, and he could see from the timestamp in the corner of the screen that this footage was from around 5:30 p.m. on June 27th, which was the day of the last job written in Jack's logbook. Once it was up on the screen, Hoole nodded for the investigators to press play, and then he watched as the footage played on screen. And it showed Jack's dump truck pulling into the parking lot, followed closely by a white minivan. After Jack's truck parked, 2 people got out of the truck. And unfortunately, it was impossible to identify really anything about these people. They couldn't tell if they were men or women or man and woman. It was just totally unclear. However, there was one thing that was definitely true about these people, and it was what they were actually doing. They were clearly dumping Jack's body. One of them went around to the back of the dump truck and checked to make sure that tarp was secure, and then they both walked over to the white minivan, got in, and drove away. And so Hoole's mind was racing now, because it looked like there were at least 3 people involved in Jack's murder. There were the 2 people that were just out and about, sort of dealing with the truck, and then whoever was driving the white minivan. But another unfortunate reality was this footage was so fuzzy that they couldn't even pull the license plate for that minivan. And Hoole was naturally pretty frustrated by that. But then the investigator said there was actually one more thing he wanted to show him, and he pulled up another portion of security video. This one was from the evening of July 4th, which was 7 days after Jack's dump truck was left abandoned in the parking lot, and 1 day before police, i.e. Hoole, found the truck parked in that lot. The investigator told Hoole that this footage he was about to see was from a different security camera, which was positioned on the other side of the parking lot from where the dump truck was parked. And then when he hit play, he directed Hoole's attention to one particular car pulling into the parking lot. Now, the angle on this car was much closer, so there was a lot more detail visible than in the first video. And as Hoole watched, he saw what clearly was a young woman get out of the passenger seat and walk toward the store. Hoole leaned in close and squinted, and he realized he knew this woman because it was Jack's own daughter, Megan. Later that day, Hoole walked into an interrogation room in the Derry police station, where Megan was waiting for him. When Hoole walked in, he made a point to shake her hand and smile, acting as friendly and sympathetic as possible. He did not want to let on that he was looking at her as a suspect, so he didn't mention that they had video of her in the same parking lot where Jack's body was found, just a day before they found it. But as they started talking, Megan actually brought it up herself, that she happened to have been in the exact same lot that her father was ultimately found in. She said she had been shocked when she found out, one, that her father was dead, of course, but also that he was dumped in that Target lot. She had been there recently. She said her boyfriend Walter's sister lived in Saugus, and they had visited her for the 4th of July in an attempt to get their mind off their father's disappearance because at the time, he had not been found yet. Megan said they had unexpectedly decided to spend the night there, so they had driven to the nearest Target to get a contacts case. And when she said that, she just shook her head and said she couldn't believe her dad had basically been right there. She was so close to him. Hoole had to admit, this story did not sound totally crazy. After all, in the security video, Megan didn't go anywhere near the actual part of the lot where Jack's truck was parked. But still, he had a hard time believing that this was just one big coincidence, especially because when he was reviewing what Megan had told the police when she had first reported her father missing, he realized that she had said she last saw her dad on the night of Monday, June 27th, when she and her boyfriend Walter had gone to his place to pick up an air conditioner. But now, Hoole knew that was impossible, because the security video showed that Jack was already dead in the parking lot on the night of June 27th. So during this interview with Megan, Hoole asked Megan again, "When was the last time you saw your father?" And once again, without missing a beat, she said it was the night of June 27th. Hoole asked her if she was positive about the date, and she said yes, absolutely. So, without tipping his hand that he felt like for sure Megan was lying here, Hoole let her go and immediately called in her boyfriend Walter, who had been waiting in the hallway. According to Megan, Walter was the one who actually drove her to that Target in Saugus. Hoole wanted to question the couple separately so he could see if there were any contradictions in their stories. But when he spoke to Walter, Walter repeated the exact same things Megan had said about why they were in the area and why they went to that Target to get a contacts case. Walter also included the detail about the last time they saw Jack being the night of the 27th. So basically, Walter and Megan's stories are the same. But to Hoole, the only thing he thought when he heard this consistency is that clearly what's happened here is Megan and Walter have rehearsed this story because it is their alibi. But they don't realize there was time-stamped security footage that would contradict it. The following afternoon, Hoole sat at his desk, combing through a copy of Jack's phone records. He'd sent officers out that morning to interview all of Megan's family and friends to see if they knew anything that could really help them pin the blame on Megan. And they'd quickly learned that Megan and Walter had moved in together recently, and Jack did not approve. So Hoole began to wonder, maybe the young couple might have killed Jack so he would stay out of their way. Now, Megan at some point here found out from her friends who were being spoken to that clearly Megan was being investigated. And Megan had already called Hoole to revise her testimony. She was now claiming that actually the last time she saw her dad was on the night of the 26th, not the 27th. But Hoole didn't buy that she and Walter had both made the same mistake about the date. They both seemed really confident when they said 27th. And so Hoole was hoping that if he could just retrace Jack's steps on the day of his death, he'd find some proof that Megan and Walter were somehow involved. Hoole had already called around to check on the last scheduled job in Jack's logbook, which was on the morning of June 27th. And that client had confirmed that Jack was definitely there, and security footage from the local dump had shown Jack dropping off the trash afterwards around 2 p.m. But that left about a 3-hour gap on the afternoon of June 27th where Jack's whereabouts were unaccounted for. And really, Jack had to have been killed sometime in that window. So now Hoole hoped that Jack's phone records might help him figure out where Jack went after leaving the dump that afternoon. Hoole had been able to match most of the phone numbers that Jack dialed or received calls from to contacts in Jack's logbook, except for one. On the morning of June 27th, he had gotten a call from a number that wasn't anywhere in his contacts list. And at 2:07 that afternoon, while Jack was finishing up at the dump and just a few hours before his dead body was left in a Target parking lot, he'd gotten a second call from that same number. And so now, Hoole called that number, but it went straight to voicemail. So he called the cell provider and asked them to look up who this number belonged to. And he found out it was registered to a man named Charlie Waz. And suddenly, something clicked in Hoole's mind. And so he reached over and he grabbed Jack's logbook and he flipped to the page where Jack had scribbled down that address, 145 North Road, and also the name Charlie. This Charlie may be the same Charlie who called from that unknown number. And also, this Charlie may have been the last person to see Jack alive. Or maybe Charlie was the one who killed him. The cell provider employee also told Hoole that that number came from a prepaid phone, the kind you can buy at a convenience store and load minutes onto without signing up for a long-term contract, and that it had been activated on June 19th, just 8 days before Jack's murder. Hoole asked the worker to send over a full copy of the prepaid phone call's records, and then they hung up. Then Hoole logged onto the police database and looked up the name Charlie Waz, but he didn't find anything. No criminal records or driver's licenses or car registrations. And so Hoole had a feeling that this had to be a fake name, that there was no Charlie Waz. And what seemed to confirm that even further was when he looked up that address, the 145 North Road that was in the book next to the word Charlie. There was no Charlie affiliated with that property at all. The owner of 145 North Road was somebody called Michael Connors, but that name didn't mean anything to Hoole, and it certainly wasn't Charlie. So Hoole stood up from his desk and he grabbed his car keys. It was time to go talk with whoever actually lived at 145 North Road. Less than an hour later, Detective Hoole pulled onto a gravel driveway at 145 North Road, the address of the secluded farm scribbled in Jack Reed's logbook. He parked his car and he walked up to the big white house and he rang the doorbell. And the middle-aged man who answered the door seemed very calm and composed, until Hoole showed him his badge. Then the man started acting really jumpy. As they stood in the doorway, Hoole asked the man if he was Michael Connors, and the man nodded and said yes. Hoole asked if he knew a man named Jack Reed, and Michael quickly said no. And when Hoole asked why his address was in Jack Reed's logbook, Michael stammered out that he didn't know. It seemed fairly obvious to Hoole already that Michael clearly knew more than he was admitting to. And so he asked Michael where he'd been on the afternoon of June 27th. And Michael, very nervously and very quickly, said that he had spent all day doing repair work at a friend's lake house 30 miles away, and he didn't get home until late that night. And then he gave Hoole the names of a few other contractors who were also working on these repairs, who could verify his alibi. So Hoole, without giving off how suspicious he felt of this guy, wrote down the contractors' names and contact information, and then, as calm as could be, he asked Michael if he could take a look around, both inside his house and outside. Michael, who looked pretty resigned at this point, nodded and said yes, and then he stepped aside. And so Hoole walked into the house and began walking from room to room. But he didn't see any blood or anything really obviously suspicious. But then he went outside and he found this muddy path that led over to the barn, which was only a short distance from the main house. And when he reached the barn, he opened up the heavy wooden door, and sunlight flooded in. Hoole stepped inside, and right away he was struck by how neat it was in here. He began looking behind the hay bales, and he shined his flashlights in the corners, and he bent down to examine the dirt and the straw on the ground, but it was like the barn was spotless, almost like the barn had recently been cleaned really thoroughly. When Hoole was done in the barn, he went outside and walked back towards the main house. And as he did, he saw Michael standing by the back door, staring right at him, like he had been really watching him closely as he was over at the barn. And so Hoole walked over to Michael, and very calmly, he asked him one last question. Did he know anyone named Megan Reed? And Michael said no, but the way he said it was noticeably less anxious, as if, for really the first time, he was telling the truth here. After that, as Hoole walked back to his car to leave, he thought that even though he hadn't found any hard evidence at this farm, Michael's weird behavior seemed to be saying a lot. Later that day, Hoole hung up the phone in his office, feeling very frustrated. He called every single one of those contractors who Michael had given him, and they had all confirmed his alibi. Michael had been doing repairs at his friend's house, 30 miles away, at the time of Jack's death. So Hoole figured that, Michael couldn't have been directly involved in the murder, but based on his very suspicious behavior, it seemed like he probably knew something had happened on his property, maybe while he was away. And this gave Hoole something to work with, because it could mean that at least one of Jack's 3 or more killers was close enough with Michael that Michael was willing to lie to protect them. But that was about all he had to work with. There was no obvious link between Michael Connors and Jack's daughter Megan and her boyfriend Walter, who were still really his only real suspects. And so he was starting to think that maybe he'd been looking in the wrong direction, and that Megan and Walter maybe weren't involved after all. It was still only a few days into the investigation, and there were plenty of other potential suspects to dig into, like Jack's ex-partners and his adult children from his first relationship and all the other clients in his logbook. But just then, Hoole's fax machine whirred to life. The cell provider was finally sending over the call records from Charlie's prepaid phone. Once it was done printing, Hoole ripped the sheet out of the machine and began looking over the call log. The phone had only been activated a week before Jack's murder, and it hadn't been used at all since the evening Jack was killed. And every single call that had been made or received on that phone was to Jack's number, except for one. And when Hoole looked into the owner of that one other number, everything about the case began to fall into place. Based on those phone records, as well as interviews with the various suspects, this is what police believe happened to Jack Reed on June 27, 2005. That afternoon, while Jack's dump truck was pulling into the gravel driveway at 145 North Road, two of Jack's killers were inside of that house waiting for him. One of them was sitting on the couch, nervously tapping their feet, and then that killer looked up and saw their accomplice staring right at them, looking very annoyed, like, "Stop tapping your feet." And so they did. But just then, the doorbell rang. The calmer of the two killers walked over to answer it, while the more nervous one stayed on the couch. And the nervous one, they listened as the door opened, and they could hear the sound of their accomplice greeting Jack, and then a few seconds later, Jack walked into the living room. And the nervous killer, when they saw Jack, they kind of jumped to their feet and tried to act natural, but very likely they were acting incredibly nervous. But after a sort of awkward conversation between all three of them, they left the main house and they walked down that dirt path towards the barn. As they walked, the killer, who'd been very nervous, sort of hung back, walking a few steps behind Jack. And then as they got close to the barn, their heart began to pound. I mean, they'd rehearsed this a dozen times and they knew exactly what they had to do. But actually doing it was going to be the hard part. Then the doors to the barn opened up, and inside, Jack would have seen there were two more people waiting for him. But before Jack could react, the nervous killer leapt forward and tackled Jack to the ground. And then a second later, the nervous killer heard a loud thump and looked up to see one of their accomplices standing above them, holding a hammer that was now dripping with blood. The nervous killer climbed to their feet and looked down at Jack, who was now lying on the floor of the barn with a gaping hole in the side of his skull. It was so gruesome that the nervous killer had to go outside and vomit. And then when they came back inside, the other three had unrolled this big piece of plastic on the floor of the barn, and they were placing Jack's body in the center of it. Blood was still pouring out of his head, pooling into this big red puddle on the plastic. I mean, it was so awful. Then one of the killers grabbed the bloody hammer and said that if they could just stop Jack's heart, it would stop the bleeding. And so they raised the hammer and began pounding on Jack's chest. And after that, the bleeding did slow down. And the four killers worked together to wrap Jack's body in the plastic. Then, once he was all wrapped up, they carried him outside and loaded his body into the back of his own dump truck. The killer who had first answered the door, the calmer of the killers, got in the driver's seat of the dump truck. And the nervous killer, the one who had been tapping their foot, the one who had initially tackled Jack to the ground, they climbed into the passenger seat. The other two, the ones who had been waiting in the barn, climbed into a minivan, and they followed behind them as they drove all the way across state lines to Saugus, Massachusetts, more than an hour away. When they finally got to Saugus, they pulled into the first major parking lot they came across, a Target store. They parked the dump truck near the back of the lot, and then when they got out, the nervous killer double-checked the tarp to make sure it was secure, and then they, along with their calmer accomplice, walked across the lot to the white minivan, and they climbed inside. After that, all four killers drove all the way back to New Hampshire to clean up the barn, because the farm's owner, Michael Connors, expected it to be left in perfect condition. Now, Michael Connors, the owner of the barn, was not directly involved in the murder scheme. However, he did know that the mastermind of the murder was going to be using his property while he was gone. However, he would testify that he did not know what they were doing and just asked that they keep it clean when he got back. Ultimately, the reason he allowed his property to be used at all is because he was doing a favor to the mastermind of the murder, who was his longtime friend and business partner, and also the very same self-made Las Vegas millionaire that Jack Reed himself had viewed as this big success story, whose path in life Jack was hoping to emulate. The millionaire's name was John Brooks, and he believed that when Jack had helped him move, it was a job he had done for him a few years back, that Jack, during that move, had stolen some of his motorcycles and jewelry. Now, there was no evidence to actually back this up, but John Brooks was convinced, and he held a grudge. So in retaliation, a few months after the move, Brooks had sent his son Jesse to Jack's home to scare him. That's who Jack had spotted in the middle of the night on his property almost 2 years ago, the strange prowler who had literally called out to Jack by name. But when Jack came outside to confront him and literally fired a gun at Jesse. Jesse and his dad did not stop what they were doing. Instead, Brooks only got angrier, and he vowed to get revenge. So he'd sent 4 people out to New Hampshire to kill Jack. It was his son Jesse, Jesse's friend Michael Benton, who was not the same as the Michael who owned the farm, and the 2 other men who were named Joseph Vrooman and Robin Knight. All 5 men were eventually convicted of taking part in the murder. John Brooks was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robin Knight was also sentenced to life. Michael Benton, not Michael Connors, the owner of the barn, so Michael Benton got 33 years to life. Joseph Vrooman was sentenced to between 17 and 35 years, and Jesse Brooks was sentenced to 15 to 30 years. He was released on parole in 2023. At 8 p.m. on April 25th, 1977, a 31-year-old man named Apolinario Souza Correa poured water on the campfire that he had built with his 3 brothers, Firmino, Aleriano, and Jose, on the beach of a small, uninhabited island in northeast Brazil. The island was called Crab Island, and Apolinario and his family would take their boat there all the time because they would harvest lumber that they would then sell to local construction workers. Now, when they would go out to Crab Island, pretty much every single time, there was nobody else on this island. It was all theirs. But there was a specific reason for that. It was because most of their neighbors thought that Crab Island was haunted. People who visited the island would often report hearing these strange voices coming from the forest, in particular at night, even though nobody lived on this island. And then sometimes people even saw lights flashing over the treetops. But Apolinario and his brothers made really good money by going out to Crab Island, and also they just were not afraid of the stories people told. They thought they were all made up. And so today, they had arrived at Crab Island during high tide, which had been at about 12 p.m., and then they had spent the entire afternoon chopping down trees. But that didn't concern them, because they really hadn't planned to immediately sail back home. They had planned to actually have dinner on the island after they were done working, and then maybe sleep for a few hours actually on their boat while it was out on the mud. And then while they were sleeping for a few hours, the tide would come back in again, it would raise their boat up, they would wake up, and they'd be ready to sail home at that point. And so that's what they did. They had this long day of work, they had their dinner by the campfire, and then after Apolinario put out the fire, he and his brothers waded into the mud over towards their boat, which was literally sitting, low tide on the mud, and they climbed on board, they walked into the main cabin, they laid down their sleeping pads, and it didn't take long for them all to fall asleep. Now, Apolinario and his brothers had only intended to sleep until about midnight. But when Apolinario woke back up again, although it was still dark in the cabin, he looked out the tiny window and he saw that the sky outside was already pink from the sunrise. And when he saw this, he groaned because he knew they had overslept and had missed high tide. Basically, their boat had gone back up and then back down into the mud, and now they were stuck again and would have to wait likely until noon to finally be able to leave. So it was just a nuisance. And so at this point, Apolinario looked over to see if his 3 brothers were still asleep. And he saw that Firmino and Jose were still asleep on their sleeping pads with their blankets pulled up over their faces. But his 3rd brother, Aleriano, his sleeping pad was empty and he wasn't inside the cabin. And so as Apolinario is realizing, his 3rd brother is gone, doesn't know where he is, he hears this just deafening screaming coming from outside on the boat, but not inside the main cabin. And so immediately Apolinario, he jumps up, he runs outside, and he finds his 3rd brother, Aleriano. And his brother was completely covered in burns. Apolinario was so horrified that he just froze because it looked like his brother's skin had literally been set on fire. And then he noticed something even stranger about the whole thing, which was, his brother, despite being so badly burned, his clothes didn't appear burned. It was like literally just his skin, like somehow his skin had caught fire, but nothing else on him. And his brother is just screaming in agony, and Apolinario has no idea what to do. He has no idea how this even happened. And while this is happening, this sort of shocked moment, Apolinario begins to hear moaning coming from back inside the cabin where he came from. And so just sort of acting on instinct, he ran back inside the cabin, and remember his two brothers, Firmino and Jose, their blankets were up over their heads, so he hadn't seen them yet. And so he runs in, he knows the moaning is coming from one of them, and he pulls back the blankets, and he sees the moaning is coming from Firmino, and his skin is just horribly burned. Like his skin is literally falling off his body, but just like his other brother, his clothes didn't appear to be burned at all. It was like just his skin had been set on fire, and he's moaning in just pure agony. And then Apolinario, he looks over at his other brother, who's also on his sleeping pad, Jose, and he was not burned, but he was dead. Now, unfortunately, because of the tides, Apolinario still had to wait a full 6 hours before he could get his brothers off the island. And so they waited until the tide came in, and then finally they took off. And then when they got back to land, Oleriano, who was the one who was screaming outside the main cabin, who had, burns all over his body, he was badly hurt, but not maybe critically so. He stayed behind with Jose's body, and Apolinario wound up taking Firmino to the hospital because his injuries looked like they could be critical. When they finally got to the hospital, Firmino was like barely conscious, like his injuries were really taking a toll on him. It was like his body was shutting down. But as soon as he was checked in, the doctors asked him like, hey, just tell us how you got these burns. Give us some indication of how this happened. And right before Firmino slipped into a coma from his burns, he was able to tell them that when he and his brothers were still out at Crab Island, he had looked out the window from inside the cabin of his boat when they were all sleeping in the boat, and outside there was this inexplicable ball of fire hovering in the air. And that's all he remembered. He had no idea how he actually got burned. So the police opened an investigation into whatever happened that night at Crab Island, and they would come up with several theories that, maybe could explain it, including that maybe the men had simply injured each other and were just sort of lying about it. Maybe they had taken drugs or were under the influence of something, and while being that way, they could have hurt themselves or each other, or just something could have happened that they didn't remember. Or another theory was maybe lightning struck the beach and somehow reflected off the sand, and bolts of lightning made their way out into the boat and, burned two and killed one. But the reality is these theories, there was no evidence to support any of them. In fact, the big takeaway from this investigation is basically that when they went out to that island, they found nothing. There was just no evidence whatsoever. Ultimately, the two injured surviving brothers, Firmino and Oleriano, they would make full recoveries, but neither of them ever could remember any meaningful details of what happened. And so eventually the case was closed without really any answers. But strange stories continued to come from Crab Island. People continued to hear voices and see strange lights. And then finally, in April of 1986, so 9 years after the death of Jose, a different crew of 4 men traveled out to Crab Island to harvest timber. And at some point, they all recalled hearing this loud crashing sound out in the woods. And then they all just fell unconscious. And when they woke up again, it was 18 hours later. One of them was dead, and another one was inexplicably covered in burns. And just like the brothers 9 years earlier, the survivors of this incident had no memory of what happened. This is a paid ad by BetterHelp. It's normal to long for a time when, connection felt easy and being close to people didn't take so much effort. And then you take a look at your life now and it just feels different, busier and more complicated. I mean, there are moments I think about sometimes, nothing big, just, sitting with people I cared about, talking about nothing. At the time, those moments themselves didn't feel important. But now, looking back, I think I'd tell that version of myself to cherish those moments as they were occurring because they don't last forever. And so someday, the relationships you have today may be the ones you wish you had held on to a little bit tighter. Therapy may be able to help you work through life's changes and provide the tools to navigate what's next, even if it looks different than it used to. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mr. Ballen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the night of June 12, 1993, 69-year-old Deke Slayton climbed into bed in his home in League City, Texas. And even this small action, getting in bed, took a lot of effort for Deke because he was very, very sick. So Deke had a brain tumor. He'd actually been diagnosed the year before, but had then quickly gone into remission, so he thought he'd beaten it. But it had unfortunately come back a few months later, and this time it was much worse. Deke knew eventually this thing was going to kill him, and unfortunately, probably sooner than later. His wife and daughter had been taking care of him as he got weaker and sicker. And while he certainly appreciated it, the reality is it really bothered him. I mean, he was a tough guy, and he was used to being the person who took care of other people, not the other way around. But more than that, the worst part of him getting sick was he hadn't been able to fly a plane in months. So Deke was like a legend in the aviation community. As a young man, he'd been in the Air Force, and he'd flown in World War II combat missions, some of the most harrowing aerial combat in recorded history. And Deke had loved being up high and looking down at the world from his cockpit so much that after the war was over, he'd gone one step further, to space. And he had not just become a regular astronaut. He'd been on NASA's first team of astronauts to literally ever go to space. And then after he had gotten too old for space trips, he continued to work for NASA in various capacities until his retirement 10 years ago. But retiring had not meant he just stopped, aerial travel completely. I mean, he was done flying into space, but he still flew planes. In fact, he was a hugely successful amateur air racer, which is a competitive sport where aircraft race one another through basically an aerial obstacle course. And so now, as Deke's life was sort of slipping through his fingers, all he found himself wanting to do was just go fly. He had this plane called a Stinger, which he used for racing. It was this red, small plane that was super loud, pretty unique, but he loved this plane, and he just constantly fantasized about getting back in the cockpit and going for a ride. However, Deke did know that because of his tumor, realistically, him flying a plane would not be safe. His speech was shaky, and he was tired all the time. Also, his balance and decision-making were affected. And then on top of the physical limitations from his tumor, also there was the reality that his Stinger plane was currently in storage. But as Deke laid in bed that night, feeling just physically awful and, literally feeling his life sort of slipping away, all he wanted was just one more time to fly. And it just became so overpowering, that desire to fly again, that he decided while he was laying there that tomorrow, first thing in the morning, whether I am sick or not, I am getting up, I am taking my Stinger out of storage, and I am going for a ride. Early the next morning, at the John Wayne Airport in Southern California, which was over 1,500 miles away from where Deke lived, an airport manager stepped into his office, ready to start his shift. He worked for the airport's noise abatement department, which was responsible for making sure that the planes that flew in and out didn't make too much noise and drive the neighbors crazy. And usually, this early in the morning, things were pretty calm and uneventful. But today, as soon as the manager got into his office, he heard his desk phone ring. And when he answered it, the person on the other end said they were a local resident and they wanted to make a complaint. There had just been a plane flying low over her house, making a ton of noise. The manager immediately looked over at the clock and saw it was just before 8 a.m., which meant that the plane that this resident was complaining about was in violation of the airport's curfew. John Wayne Airport had a policy where they didn't let any planes take off before 8 a.m. on Sundays, specifically to avoid this, to avoid bothering the locals too early. And so on the phone, this, perturbed resident gave a description of the aircraft, which was a small, red racing Stinger. And so the manager took some notes, hung up, and was about to, start making some phone calls when their phone rang again. And it was another resident with basically the exact same complaint. And then after that, this manager got more and more calls all about this red plane. And all the people who were complaining basically said they had heard it, they had seen it. It was like doing these crazy aerial maneuvers. but now it was gone. So they were calling sort of after the fact. It's gone now, but it was really, really disruptive. Some of the callers actually said that at certain points, this plane, when they saw it, had flown so low, they were able to read its identification number, and they had written it down to report it. And so they told the manager that it was N21X. That was the number on this plane. And so at some point, when the manager had a chance, in between all these calls they were getting, they looked up on their Over the Skies of California that morning. It just doesn't make any sense. And today, that warning letter that the manager from the John Wayne Airport sent to Deke, that ultimately his wife got and was so confused by, that letter actually sits on display at the Deke Slayton Memorial Space Museum. One morning in June of 1972, a hospital administrator named Harold Michaels ran down the hallway of the Alameda Hospital in California. He was totally out of breath. He was going as fast as he could, and as he turned the corner, he nearly knocked over a gurney, but he didn't even stop to apologize to the person who was pushing it. He just kept on running as fast as he could until he got to the cafeteria, where all the nurses and doctors were eating before they started their morning shift. And as soon as he got in there, totally out of breath, he just yelled out to everybody hey, pay attention, I have a very important announcement. And so immediately, the room goes silent, all the staff, they turn to look to see what's going on here. And all he said was, the hospital needs to update its disaster plan. But as Harold paused for a second to catch his breath and let this information sort of be soaked in by the audience, he looked around and he saw pretty much everybody was looking back at him with just looks of total confusion on their face. And Harold definitely understood why they might react that way, because there really was no clear reason for Harold to be suddenly barging in here and demanding they update this plan. There hadn't been any recent mass casualty events or, natural disasters or anything. This was just a normal day at the hospital. But here Harold was acting like there was some disaster at hand. And so there was this moment of wait, are you serious? What's going on here? But before anybody could really ask any questions, he just said, look, I want to make sure we are capable of handling a mass casualty event, an emergency. We need to have a better plan in place in case something really terrible happens. We don't want to be caught flat-footed. And so again, there was a sort of pause, and everyone's still looking back at Harold what's prompting this? And at some point, before anybody moved, somebody raised their hand and they were why? But Harold, he was not having it. He just said, stop everything you're doing. Put your breakfasts away. I don't care what you think about this. Right now, go update the disaster plan. 8 months later, on the morning of February 7th, 1973, Harold sat around a conference table with the members of the hospital's disaster committee. They'd been holding meetings every month since the previous summer to update their emergency procedures. And just 2 days ago, at an all-staff meeting, they had unveiled the new disaster plan that Harold had frantically demanded. And so every doctor and nurse and clerk at the hospital had been briefed on the new procedures, and there was a drill scheduled for the very next morning to practice what to do. And Harold should have felt calmer knowing that they were now, officially prepared, at least more so than they had been before he demanded the update. But when the meeting wrapped, all Harold could focus on was this sort of nameless feeling of dread in the pit of his stomach. But after work that day, he still drove home, he ate dinner, and, sat on his couch and tried to relax, but he just couldn't. Fast forward to about 8:30 that night, and Harold was running out of his house, leaping in his car, and driving as fast as he could back to the hospital. He had just gotten a phone call from the hospital saying that he had to come back here right away. And when he got to the hospital, he saw there was a line of police officers directing traffic, and there were EMTs and firefighters rushing bleeding patients into the building on stretchers. I mean, it was madness. When Harold made it inside, the ER was bustling with nurses rolling gurneys down the halls and prepping extra beds and carrying these big boxes of blood packs from the local blood bank. Harold counted at least 6 full surgical teams standing around, scrubbed and ready to go before any patients had even arrived. And then at this point, a nurse grabbed Harold and told him that the hospital's phone lines had gone down about 30 minutes ago, but More than 100 off-duty doctors and staff members had shown up immediately when they heard the news, without even waiting to be officially called in. And when they got to the hospital, they went straight to their stations and knew exactly what to do because they'd all been preparing for that big disaster drill in the morning. And so as Harold is standing here sort of processing the scene, he watched as EMTs wheeled in a man with third-degree burns all over his body, and right away a team of doctors swooped in and guided him into a trauma room. And the rest of the doctors all waited in an orderly line to take over the next patients as soon as they came through the doors. And Harold couldn't help but feel really vindicated. And also a little spooked, because this was all happening exactly as he knew it would. It would turn out on that morning, months earlier, when Harold bolted into the cafeteria and told everybody to stop what they were doing and update the disaster plan. Well, that morning, Harold had woken up from this incredibly lucid, vivid dream, perhaps the most vivid dream he had had in his whole life. In this dream, a plane had crashed into the middle of the city, leaving hundreds of people dead and horribly injured, and it was basically up to his hospital to save people. And so that was why he'd been so insistent that morning on updating the emergency plan, because he felt like if that really happened, like in the dream, if there was a plane crash, I don't know if we have the capacity to handle it. Like that many patients all at once, I don't know if we can do that. And so we better update things right now. And so fast forward 8 months to February 7th, 1973, literally just hours before Harold's hospital was going to conduct a drill to practice the new disaster plan they had come up with, a Navy jet had smashed into a 4-story apartment building in the middle of the city. But because of Harold's dream, which ultimately, prompted him to force his hospital to update their disaster plan, because of that, well, when this actual plane crash happened, Harold's hospital and his whole staff were ready. Initial estimates at the crash scene had predicted at least 50 people would die. But thanks to Harold's staff and their updated disaster plan, only 11 people actually did.